The digital space is a world of connection and opportunity. Take this moment, for example.
The web has made it possible for you to enroll in this program, where you will learn from the personal stories of developers at Meta.
By the time you have completed this professional certificate, you can become a creator of digital experiences. Connection is evolving, and so are you.
You might not have a background in tech at all, and that's okay.
Even if you have no experience, this program can get you job ready within a single year.
So, how can this professional certificate prepare you for a job at an organization like Meta?
The Front-End Developer Professional Certificate will help you build job-ready skills for a front-end development role while earning a credential from Meta.
From Meta developers, you will learn about how they collaborate to create and test responsive, high-performance websites and applications.
You'll also discuss interesting topics with other aspiring front-end developers and complete a range of coding exercises to improve your skills.
It's important to complete all the courses in the certificate in order,
as each course will build on your skills.
Although we have a recommended schedule for each course, the program is entirely self-paced, which means your time is your own to manage.
As you make your way through the first 4 courses in this certificate, you'll learn how to code interactive web pages using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript.
You'll also learn how to use the Bootstrap framework before diving into the world of React,
a widely used JavaScript library that was created here at Meta.
Websites built using React are fast, scalable, secure, and allow for rich user experience.
It's no wonder it's the choice of leading companies.
For your final project, you will complete a beautiful professional website for your portfolio, complete with interactivity to showcase during your job search.
You'll also be ready to collaborate with other developers, as you will have learned to use Git and GitHub for version control.
If you're hoping to operate independently or in a smaller team, not to worry. We've also got you covered when it comes to the basics of user experience.
You'll learn how to research a user's needs, create wireframes using popular industry tools like Figma, and design interactivity.
In the final course, you will prepare for the coding interview. You'll practice your interview skills, refine your resume, and tackle some common coding challenges that typically form part of technical job interviews.
Once you complete the program, you'll get access to the Meta Career Program's job board,
a job search platform that connects you with over 200 employers who have committed to sourcing talent through Meta certificate programs.
Who knows where you will end up? Whatever the future of connection looks like, you'll be part of its creation. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to this course on HTML and CSS. Every day when you browse the internet, you're interacting with HTML and CSS code. By now, you probably know a little bit about how that works. And if you're taking this course, you want to find out even more. That's great. There will be a short overview of HTML and CSS just after this introduction. But first, let's briefly go through what you'll be doing in this course. You'll start off by learning how HTML is used in the real world. This includes learning about semantic and meta tags and the importance of having a structured approach so that you can create well-formed web pages. Next up are user input and forms, and in this part of the course, you will create and test a form by yourself. You will learn about advanced input types, how to validate input and provide feedback to improve the user experience of a form. But what would the web be without media? The next HTML section will focus on bringing websites to life with media elements. You will learn how to embed video and audio players and even iframes. Following the module about HTML is one all about CSS. This part of the course will go beyond basic styling. You will learn how to create layouts with grids and flexboxes. You will also learn about CSS selectors and how you can combine them to refine the styling of elements on your web pages. Not only that, but you'll also learn how to use pseudo-class selectors to improve the interactivity of a web page. But there's even more. You will learn how to add effects on web pages using purely CSS, and you will cover basic transform and transition animations, as well as more advanced animations using keyframes. Next, you will learn how to use browser developer tools and UI testing to debug HTML and CSS code. The final part of the module is about the graded assessment. For this assessment, you will build a homepage for a fictional company, and you'll get an opportunity to review your classmates' projects as well, since this is a peer-graded assignment. There are many videos in the course that will gradually guide you towards your goal of becoming a developer. Watch, pause, rewind and re-watch the videos until you are confident in your skills. Then consolidate your knowledge by consulting the course readings and putting your skills into practice during the course exercises. Along the way, you'll encounter several knowledge quizzes where you can self-check your progress. And remember, you're not alone in considering a career as a developer, which is why you'll also work with course discussion prompts that help you to connect with your classmates. It's a great way to share knowledge, discuss difficulties, and grow a network of contacts in the web development world. You have probably encountered a few new words and technical terms in this video. Don't worry if you don't fully understand all these terms right now. Everything will become clearer soon. After all, this is part of the reason why you're taking this course. The average person doesn't know much about what happens behind the scenes when they browse the internet on their phone or computer. But as an aspiring developer, you are aware of how the content on screen is controlled by HTML and CSS. And by now you know that HTML is a markup language used to create web pages. In fact, it's the most basic and fundamental language for creating web pages. And together with CSS, it has helped the web browser expand beyond just desktop computers. HTML has been around since 1990, and it was originally designed to provide a way for people to share information over the internet. HTML web pages used to only show basic images and text. The websites you browse today are very different. This is because HTML can do much more than just defining how content is displayed in the browser. HTML is great, but together with CSS, it can do so much more. CSS is a style sheet language that is used to describe the look and layout of a document written in HTML. While CSS is not a programming language, it does allow for some programming-like features, such as variables and nested rules. And what it does is give you control over color, size, spacing, fonts, positioning, and more. One of the fundamental principles of CSS is the separation of content and style. That means you can change a web page's appearance without editing its underlying HTML. W3C, the organization responsible for standards for the World Wide Web, manages both HTML and CSS specifications. They continually improve their capabilities to ensure that they are always oriented towards current requirements. Many new features were added to the current version of HTML that make it easier to use than previous versions. These are better support for multimedia content, such as audio and video, improved support for responsive design, such as adapting the web page layout depending on the device the web page is viewed on, new form input types such as sliders and range inputs, date and color pickers, new form validation features, and new ways to work with text, such as spell checking and text editing. Some major additions released for CSS in 2011 ensure that CSS can style and control a website regardless of the media content or the device used for viewing the page. The additions to the current version are media queries, which allow for different styles to be applied depending on the device being used, box sizing, which allows developers to specify how they want their content to be sized and padded, multiple backgrounds, which mean you can specify multiple background images for an element, border images, which allow developers to specify an image as a border instead of a solid color or style, text shadows, which mean you can add shadows behind text for a more three-dimensional look, and transformations and transitions, which allow developers to animate elements on a web page. In essence, the combination of HTML and CSS allows websites to adapt their design and layout based on the devices on which they're viewed. While this feature was initially used to support mobile devices like cell phones and tablets, the usage of HTML and CSS has grown beyond the traditional web browser and web pages. Today, web pages can be viewed not only on computers, cell phones and tablets, but also on video game consoles and even smart TVs. The web browser has truly expanded beyond traditional desktop devices, and it's all thanks to the combination of HTML and CSS. Perhaps you know a little about HTML and CSS from another course you did, or perhaps you don't know much at all. Either way, a quick summary will be useful, so let's explore some basic HTML and CSS principles and practices. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, but what does that mean? Hypertext is text which contains links to other text. Markup refers to tags and elements used within a document. HTML elements with their opening and closing tags in angle brackets make up a HTML document. These elements form the structure of a web page and describe what to display to the web browser. When it comes to HTML, it's important to know about the purpose of HTML in the web browser, the use of HTML tags and correct syntax, and how HTML elements are used in a web document. But what can you do with HTML? You can add images to a web page with HTML code. You can use it to display data in tables, and you can build forms with a wide range of inputs. Also, using the correct HTML structure and appropriate elements as a foundation is an essential part of building accessible websites. HTML can assist in ensuring web accessibility by supporting the technology people with disabilities use to interact with and understand websites. Another important concept to know about when you're talking about HTML is the Document Object Model, or DOM. Users need to be able to interact with elements on a web page. This means that a HTML document must be represented in a way that JavaScript code can query and update it. And that's the function of the DOM. It's a model of the objects in your HTML file. And web developers interact with the DOM through JavaScript to update content, set up events, and animate HTML elements. Now that you've covered the basics of HTML, let's move on to CSS, or cascading style sheets. If HTML is the frame and structure of a building, then CSS is the paint, wallpaper, fixtures, and overall style. CSS tells the web browser how to display HTML elements on screen. You use CSS to style elements within a HTML document, create an appealing layout for your web page using the box model, and arrange page elements using normal document flow. And that was your HTML and CSS refresher. Now get ready to dive deeper into learning more about these two topics. By now you know that HTML describes the content of a web page, but how do you describe the meaning of a web page? To understand this in a real-world context, think of buttons in an elevator. The vertical arrangement of buttons isn't enough for someone to understand their meaning. To convey the meaning, or semantics, of the buttons, numbers are added so that people know which button will take them to which floor. When you write HTML, it's good practice to semantically describe the content. This allows search engines and accessibility software, such as screen readers, to understand the contents of a page. Fortunately, you can do this by using some basic HTML tags. For example, using a heading tag such as H1 describes that the content is a heading. Similarly, the UL and OL tags describe lists. However, there are many more semantic HTML elements available to you as a developer. In this video, I will share a structured approach you can take to make sure that you create a well-formed web page. Let's revisit the basic structure of a HTML page, which includes the head and body. Inside the body tag, you can lay out the website with various semantic tags to describe each of the sections. For a typical HTML page, the structure can be semantically described using the header, main, and footer semantic HTML tags. For example, suppose you lay out your page with a header section that contains some company logo and navigation links. Then a main section contains sections and articles. Finally, a footer section contains contact information and social media links. The main navigation section of your web page can also be described semantically using the nav tag. Depending on how a web page is designed, the nav element is often placed after the header element, and the header element is used for logos. The main links of your website are then added inside the nav element. It is common practice for developers to specify their links as an unordered list inside the nav element. Next is the main content of a web page. The two key semantic elements for your main content are the article and section elements. First, let's examine the article element. The HTML specification states that, according to the World Wide Web Consortium's website, the article element indicates content which represents a complete or self-contained composition in a document, page, application, or site that is independently distributable. That's quite a mouthful. It may help to think of a page in a newspaper. There are many articles on the page, and you can cut out the individual articles with scissors if you want to. The articles you can remove are like the article element. Examples of this include a forum post, a magazine or newspaper article, a blog entry, a user-submitted comment, an interactive widget or gadget, or any other independent item of content. Let's examine how the article element is used. Say you are developing a blog about your summer holiday. It's good practice to contain the blog post content inside of the article element because it's a complete self-contained composition on a web page. You should place the article element within your main element. Then you add your regular heading and paragraph tags inside the article element. The reason for doing it this way is because the main element semantically represents the main content of the page. And inside of it, there can be multiple article elements for something like a blog post list. At the end of your document is the footer element. This might contain additional navigation links or other content. It is important to note that semantic elements are not limited to this structure. Since their purpose is to describe the semantics of the content, the elements can be nested inside of each other if it accurately describes the content. Let's update the previous example to use a nested semantic structure. You add a header element to the article element. Inside the header element, add the heading element with the blog title and a paragraph element describing the date and author of the blog post. Inside the main element, add the content of the blog post. That's it. Let's examine the section element. You can add a section element to semantically define individual sections of the article. It is important to note that sections should contain heading elements to semantically describe the section. It is also possible to use section elements to describe different sections of your web page. The section element doesn't require the article element. It all depends on how you want to semantically describe your page. And now you know how to semantically describe the contents of a web page. Your web page is more accessible because the content is semantically described to add meaning. Now search engines and accessibility software can easily understand the contents of your well-formed web page.
The Little Lemon restaurant has asked me to add a new blog page to their website. They've told me that the page will contain several blog posts and that it must use semantic HTML so that search engines and accessibility software can understand the semantics of the page. I've set up my basic HTML document structure in a file named blog.html. I'll start off by adding my basic semantic structure. First, I add the header element, followed by the nav element, followed by the main element, followed by the footer element. Remember, this structure describes the semantics of this HTML document. Specifically, the header element will be used to display the Little Lemon logo, and the nav element will be used to describe the navigational structure of the website. The main element will feature the main content of the web page, and the footer will be used to display copyright information. When a search engine or accessibility software reads this document, the semantic tags will help the software understand the purpose and meaning of different sections of the document. I will now add the details to each element. Inside the header element, I add the Little Lemon logo using the image tag. Inside the nav element, I add the navigation links in an unordered list element using the UL tag. I then add 3 list item elements using the LI tag. Inside the list items, I add the hyperlinks for index.html, location.html, and blog.html using the anchor tag. In the main element, I add an h1 tag for the blog heading. The restaurant told me that there will be 2 blog posts for their website, so I add 2 article elements after the h1 element. Inside the first article element, I add an h2 tag for the title of the blog post. The title is 20% off this weekend. I then add a paragraph element below the title, which contains the blog post text. Inside the second article element, I add an h2 tag for the title, which is Our New Menu. Again, I add a paragraph element below the title, which contains the blog post text. Finally, I add a paragraph element to the footer element. In this paragraph element, I add the copyright notice. The blog page is now semantically described through the HTML document. I now save the file by pressing Ctrl and S or Command and S on Mac. I then right-click the blog.html file and select Live Preview to preview the file. The blog page looks good, and all thanks to proper semantic design that ensures accessibility and search engine optimization. I'm sure that the Little Lemon restaurant will get lots of business through their blog, and their customers with disabilities will be able to access the blog with no problems.
When was the last time you used a search engine? Probably in the last few hours or minutes. Perhaps you just wanted to quickly look something up, or maybe you needed more in-depth information on a topic. Either way, the search engine you used will have returned a list of results that were most relevant to what you searched for. But how does a search engine determine which web pages are most relevant? In this video, you will learn how search engines analyze web pages and how meta tags help provide information for search engines. A major part of launching a website is a process called search engine optimization, or SEO. This process involves making improvements to a website's content, semantics, and delivery to improve its ranking in search results. You might be wondering, what exactly does a search engine do when it analyzes a web page? Well, when a search engine visits your website, it analyzes the HTML document and media content. If it finds a link to another HTML document, it follows the link to that document and continues following links until it has finished analyzing the entire website. Based on the results of the analysis and the content on your website, the search engine will rank the website for various search terms. So while your website might be the #1 result for one search term, it could rank very low for another. Every search engine has its own algorithm for ranking websites. And while it's not disclosed how the ranks are determined, there are many best practices you can follow to influence how search engines analyze and rank your website. But for now, let's just focus on how meta tags influence website ranking. Meta tags define metadata about a web page. What is metadata, you ask? It's data about other data, which in this case is data about the web page. Meta tags are added inside the head element of your HTML document. And as you know, nothing inside the head element is displayed in the web browser. In other words, meta tags are unseen elements within the browser. Note that there is no closing tag for the meta tag. The meta element has 2 attributes, name and content. The name attribute specifies the name of the metadata, and the content attribute specifies the value of the metadata. Let's examine some examples of metadata. The author metadata specifies the author of the web page. The name attribute is author, and the content attribute is the person and company who are the author of the web page. The description metadata describes the content of the web page. This is often used by search engines as descriptive text in search results. The name attribute is set to description, and the content attribute is the descriptive text. The keywords metadata was previously used to provide search keywords for search engines. However, this led to a lot of websites using the keywords metadata to manipulate search rankings. One of the major search engines now ignores this metadata, and another uses keywords metadata as a spam indicator. Because of this, it's recommended not to include this metadata in modern web pages. Another type of metadata is the robots metadata, and it tells search engines if and how they should analyze your web page. The name robots comes from the automated software, often referred to as bots, that search engines use to analyze websites. The content attribute for robots has 4 possible values. Index tells the bot to analyze the page. Follow tells the bot to also visit all links on the web page. No index tells the bot not to analyze the page. Some bots will ignore this, so it's best not to rely on this to stop bots from analyzing your page. And no follow tells the bot not to visit links on the web page. Again, some bots will ignore this value, so it's best not to rely on it. Finally, there's the viewport metadata. The viewport metadata is important when designing responsive web pages. Why, you might ask? Because when a web page is viewed on a phone or tablet, the device will by default attempt to render the web page as if it is being viewed on a desktop. This results in a poor browsing experience for the user. The solution is to define viewport metadata. There are many values available for viewport metadata. The most used value for the mobile experiences is to set the width to device-width and the initial scale to 1.0. You can learn more about viewports in the additional reading. It's important to note that viewport metadata does not solve all the issues with browsing websites on mobile devices. The other part of the solution is responsive web design. But we were talking about search engine optimization, right? Viewport metadata is important for the user experience, and it's also important for search engine optimization. This is because many search engines now include a website's mobile experience as a part of their ranking algorithms. There is more metadata that you can define on your web page to specifically improve its presence on social media, but that's for a later video. For now, it's important to know that author, description, keywords, robots, and viewport metadata all play a role in the search engine optimization of web pages. An important part of being a developer is not just the tools you use, such as your integrated development environment, but also the repository of knowledge and code templates you build up over time. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to one of these templates, which will help you get set up quickly for building web pages. Let's open Visual Studio Code to go through the template step by step. In the folder, we have index.html along with a JS folder and a CSS folder. Inside the JS folder, there is a file named script.js. There is no content in this file. It is added to this folder so that you can easily add JavaScript code to the web page. I recommend that you add any other JavaScript files to this folder too. Next, I'll open the CSS folder. In the folder, there's a file named styles.css. Again, there is no content in this file, but it is here so that you can easily add CSS rules to the web page. Again, it's best if you add any other CSS files also to this folder. I go back to my template folder and open it in Visual Studio Code. I open the index.html file. The file has a semantic HTML document structure set up. At the top, there is the doc type declaration followed by the HTML root element. Inside the root element, there are the head and body elements. In the head element, the title and meta tags are already optimized for search engines. I recommend that you update the title along with the description and author meta tags. Below are the meta tags for the Open Graph protocol. Don't worry about the details of these tags just yet, as you'll learn about them in a later video. For now, the main thing to know is that if you plan on sharing the web page on social media, you should remember to uncomment this HTML section and update the content attributes. The next block of commented out code is for icons. If you want to show an icon in the web browser tab for your website, you can update the href attributes here to point to your icon. Remember, you always link elements for the CSS style sheet to the last section of the head element. To speed things up for you, there is a link already set up to reference the styles.css file in the CSS folder. By now, you can probably see how useful this template is. Let's continue to the body element. The body element already contains a basic semantic structure. This includes the header element for your website title or logo, the nav element for your website navigation, the main element for your main content, and the footer element for any copyright notices or links to secondary web pages. Below the footer element, you add script elements for JavaScript files. To make your life easy, a script element is already set up to reference the script.js file in the JS folder. With this template, you'll be able to quickly start building out web pages. It's worth keeping a copy of this template on your local machine to use and reference in future projects. In this video, you've been introduced to a semantic HTML template that you can use for building web pages. Good luck. Social networks are a great tool to share content with friends and family, and even with co-workers and business partners. When you share a link, most social networks generate a preview of the link to let users know what the linked web page is about. Now that you're learning more about front-end web development, you're probably wondering how social networks generate these previews. In this video, you will learn how meta tags help web pages create previews of other web pages. By using meta tags to control what information is displayed to users, you can get more clicks when you share your websites. But the meta tags web developers use for this purpose are different from the traditional SEO meta tags that you learned about earlier in this lesson. Traditional SEO meta tags are oriented toward search results, not direct links. Facebook's rapid growth led to millions of people sharing thousands of links every day. To improve the user experience, they had to find a way to display information about a website before a user clicks on the link. To address this challenge, Facebook established the Open Graph Protocol in 2010. The Open Graph Protocol is a set of metadata rules that allow web pages to describe themselves to social networks. There are many metadata options available within the protocol, but before you learn about them, let's first discuss how the Open Graph Protocol metadata is defined. Earlier in this lesson, you learned that meta tags are defined inside of the head element of a HTML document. The Open Graph Protocol also uses meta tags added to the head element, but they are slightly different. Instead of the name attribute, the Open Graph Protocol uses the property attribute to define the metadata name. Then, like the regular meta tags, it uses the content attribute to define the metadata value. Each property in the Open Graph Protocol starts with OG: as a convention to identify it as an Open Graph Protocol related tag. The Open Graph Protocol requires that you must always include 4 properties on a web page. These are title, type, URL, and image. The title property defines the title of the page. This is the text that will appear in the preview. The type property defines the type of content, such as website, video, music, or article. Depending on the value you specify as the type, other properties may be required. You will learn about these in a later video. The URL property defines the permanent web address that the social network must use for the specific page. The image property defines a URL to an image that must display when the website is shared. Together, these Open Graph Protocol properties enable social media platforms to create a preview of the shared web link. Say you share a blog post. The title of the post is the OG title, the blog post URL is the OG URL, and the image that displays is the OG image. There are several other optional properties that you will learn more about later, but let's briefly explore 3 of these. The description property provides a description of the web page. The locale property describes the language and territory of the web page's content. For example, EN_US specifies that the page is in English and the locale is the United States. And the site name property describes the name of the overall website that the web page belongs to. You've now learned how to use metadata to describe web pages so that social networks can improve user experience by previewing shared content. Next time you share a website on a social network, you can use what you've learned about Open Graph Protocol properties to generate more clicks. Little Lemon Restaurant has hired a marketing firm to help them advertise their business. The firm recommends that the restaurant run a social media campaign. So the owners of the restaurant asked me to make sure that the website is ready to be shared on different social media platforms. Now let's examine how to prepare a web page so it can be linked on social media platforms. I've opened index.html in Visual Studio Code. At a minimum, I need to add 4 pieces of metadata required by the protocol. To do this, I add the 4 meta tags inside the head element. On the first meta tag, I add the property attribute and set its value to OG:title. I then add the content attribute and set its value to our menu. This metadata is the title that will be displayed in the preview on the social media platform. It's important to note that this value should reflect the content of the individual web page and not the website as a whole. On the second meta tag, I add the property attribute and set its value to OG:type. I then add the content attribute and set its value to website. This metadata informs the social platforms that this content being shared is a website. On the third meta tag, I add the property attribute and set its value to OG:image. I then add the content attribute and set its value to logo.png. This metadata informs the social media platform what the preferred preview image is. In this case, it will be good to display the Little Lemon restaurant logo. On the last meta tag, I add the property attribute and set its value to OG:URL. I then add the content attribute and set its value to the URL of the Little Lemon website. The web page is now ready to be shared on social media platforms. However, there is some optional metadata I can add to provide additional information to the platforms. Since the platforms vary in what they display to their users, it's best to provide as much information as possible. I'll add 3 more meta tags to the head element. On the first tag, I add the property attribute and set its value to OG:description. I then add the content attribute and set its value to Little Lemon is a family-owned Mediterranean restaurant focused on traditional recipes served with a modern twist. If the social media platform displays a description of the page when it is shared, this text will be displayed to inform the users what the web page is about. On the second tag, I add the property attribute and set its value to OG:locale. I then add the content attribute and set its value to EN_US. This will inform the social media platforms that the locale of the website is US English. On the last tag, I add the property attribute and set its value to OG:site_name. I then add the content attribute and set its value to Little Lemon. Some social media platforms will also display the website name beside the page title, so this will ensure that the website title is correct. The Little Lemon website is now ready for its big social media campaign. Hopefully, this will lead to lots of new customers. In this video, you've explored a practical example of how to add Open Graph Protocol metadata. You should now know how to add the 4 required meta tags: title, type, image, and URL. You also learned how to add additional meta tags that provide extra information like the website description and locale. Well done. You've most likely encountered forms when registering an account on a website or when filling out your address for something you've bought online. As a developer, you'll use HTML forms to capture user input. Capturing input is one thing, but the form also needs to ensure the data is usable. How can you ensure the user input is valid? For example, let's say you are building an online food delivery website. Say a user accidentally makes an error when entering the delivery address and the form accepts it, although the location does not exist. It will cause a very bad user experience when the food never arrives. This is where form validation comes in. Form validation is a process that ensures that the data entered by the user in a form is valid and conforms to rules defined by the developer. There are 2 methods of form validation: client-side validation and server-side validation. Client-side validation checks for errors as soon as they are typed into the form. This is done by the web browser or by JavaScript code and provides the user with immediate feedback. The client-side validation process starts by checking if a form has been filled out correctly. If there are no errors, the form will be submitted to the server for processing. However, if there are errors, an error message will alert the user of the invalid data and how to change it for successful submission. For example, you decide to use the input element with its type attribute set to email. If the user does not enter a valid email address, the web browser will display an error message informing them that the data they entered is not a valid email address. On the other hand, server-side validation checks for errors after the data has been submitted to the web server. Server-side validation is more secure because it prevents malicious users from tampering with your website's code and submitting invalid data to your server. When the form data is received by the web server, the backend will validate the data before processing it. This validation can run more complex checks, such as checking the data against a database or validating the data against business requirements. Most websites use both client-side and server-side validation to provide immediate feedback to users, but also to protect against malicious data submission and to ensure data integrity. Let's examine how HTML allows you to do simple client-side validation. HTML has several input types that are validated by the web browser. As demonstrated in the example, email is used for email addresses. Others include tel for telephone numbers, URL for URLs such as www.meta.com, date for date values, time for time values, number for numeric values, range for numeric values which have a minimum and maximum value, and color for color selection. Say, for instance, a user makes mistakes on a user account form when entering a telephone number and a URL. The browser will validate the entered data against the requirements of the input type and provide user feedback. Another example is the required attribute, which indicates that the user must supply a value to an input field. The web browser will alert a user if a required value is outstanding. And that's the basics of client and server-side validation of forms. You'll learn more about HTML validation capabilities later in this lesson.
The Little Lemon restaurant wants to expand its service by taking online orders to deliver food to customers at home. To do this, they need their customers to set up an account on their website. In this video, you will learn how to create a simple sign-up form for user accounts on the Little Lemon website. I have set up my basic HTML document structure in a file named signup.html. I start off by adding the form element. The restaurant requires that the customer data is sent securely, so I will set the method attribute to post so that it is submitted using an HTTP post request. You will learn more about different methods of form submission later. For now, you just need to know that if you send a form via an HTTP post request, it improves the data security of the form. The restaurant wants to collect the customer's first name, last name, and email address. Of course, the form also needs a field for the password and another to confirm the password, so I need to create a form with 5 fields in total. I'll start by adding the input elements, also known as the form fields. First, I'll set up 6 div elements, 1 for each input element and 1 for the sign up button. The div elements will cause each field of the form to display in its own CSS block. Now I'll start adding the input elements. I add an input element for the first name to the first div element. Since the user will input plain text for this form field, I set the type attribute to text. I also set the name and ID attributes to user first name. Remember that the name attribute sets the key for the value submitted to the web server. Later in this video, I will explain why I set the ID attribute. Next, I add an input element for the last name. Like the first name element, I set the type attribute to text and the name and ID attributes to user last name. I then add an input element for the email address. To make sure users enter a valid email address in this field, I set the type attribute to email. Earlier you learned that doing so establishes HTML's client-side validation. I also set the name and ID attributes to user email. Next, I add the input element for the password. I want the password to be hidden on screen as the user types it, so I set the type attribute to password. When an input field is set to password, each character that a user enters will display as a placeholder character, such as a bullet point. The content in the field will contain the password that the user enters, but it will be hidden. I then set the name and ID attributes to user password. Finally, I add the input element for confirming the password. Again, I set the type to password to hide the content of the input field on screen. I then set the name and ID attributes to user confirm password. Now that our input fields are set up, I save the file and open the live preview to check the web page. Everything displays correctly. However, I'd like to improve the user experience by informing the user what each field represents. To do this, I'll add a label element before each input element. And now I want to explain why I set the ID attribute for each input field earlier in the video. The reason for this is that it allows me to associate a label with each input element. Labels improve the user experience and assist accessibility software in understanding the form. I now add a label element above the first input element. Inside the label element, I add the descriptive text for the input field. In this case, the text description will be first name. Then, to associate the label with the input field, I add the for attribute and set its value to match the value of the ID attribute of the input element. Finally, I'll add a line break tag after the label element so that the input field displays below the label. I then repeat the same process for each input element. I save the file again and open the live preview. Ah yes, that's much better. The form labels now display above the input fields. To finalize the form, I need to add one more thing, the Submit button. Inside the last div element, I add a button element. I set the button type attribute to Submit. Then inside the button element, I add the text Sign Up. I save the file again and open the live preview. The form is now ready to use. Once the backend is set up by a backend developer to accept the data submitted via the form, users will be able to create their accounts. In this video, you learned how to create a basic form with several different input fields, each in its own CSS block. You covered how to set the method attribute to submit the form in a secure way. And you also now know how to associate a label with an input field to improve the user experience. Good luck with creating your own sign-up forms.
Have you ever completed a form online and then after you've clicked on the Submit button, one of the fields turned red? There are many reasons for error messages when you complete online forms. The format could be wrong, but sometimes an error results when a field is empty or if a value is too long or too short. As a developer, you can use HTML and CSS to guide users to enter the correct data on forms and in this way save web server resources. In this video, you will learn more about the capabilities of client-side validation in HTML and how to use CSS to effectively alert users when data is incorrect. By now, you've learned about the different HTML input types and how they validate the format of data. But there are additional attributes that you can apply to elements for further validation. First, let's explore how you can ensure that the user provides a value to a form field. This example of a login form contains two fields, one for the username and one for the password. It also contains a submit button to submit the form. If a user hasn't added a username or password and clicks the submit button, the browser will allow the form to submit to the web server. But this is a waste of server resources, because although the server-side validation will pick up the missing information and prevent the processing of the request, a HTTP request was still submitted. Let's improve this form by using client-side validation to ensure the user enters values to both fields. Now, with the required attribute in the code, if one of the fields is empty and the user clicks the submit button, the request will not be submitted to the web server. The web browser will focus on the first empty input element and inform the user that a field is empty. Now the form creates a much better user experience and prevents unnecessary usage of web server resources. But user input that is too short or too long would also result in unnecessary submissions to the web server. So another way to validate user input is to specify the required length for data. Let's say you want the usernames to be at least 3 characters long and a maximum of 12 characters. Or maybe you want to ensure more secure passwords by requiring a minimum password length of 5 characters. Fortunately, there are 2 more attributes you can use to ensure the correct length of data. You can add the min length and max length attributes to the fields to specify the required length. In this case, since the minimum value for the username is set to 3, a 2-character entry would be invalid. If you click the Submit button now, the web browser will inform you of the length requirements. A built-in function of the browser will generate the message displayed on screen. Again, a much better user experience and management of web server resources. Now let's focus on the way the browser communicates errors to the users, like a form field that turns red when the data is invalid. This can be readily implemented using CSS. To highlight a field in red when the data is invalid, you use the input element selector. You then apply the pseudo class selector called invalid. You will learn more about pseudo class selectors later in this course. For now, the key thing to know is that they are used to select elements based on their state, such as whether the input data is valid or invalid. And then you add a CSS property to set the border of the element to red. But since all the form fields are empty when the form loads initially, their state is still practically invalid. This will cause all form fields to display red from the start, like demonstrated in this real-world example of a login screen. Ideally, you only want fields to appear red as the user enters invalid data. To do this, you need to apply another pseudo class called focus, which checks if the user is currently entering data into this field. Now the form will appear normal when the page first loads. And when the user starts inputting data, the field will turn red if the data is invalid. This video gave you a brief introduction to how you can use client-side validation and CSS pseudo-class selectors to improve the user experience of forms. As you learn more about JavaScript in other courses, you will be able to use even more advanced techniques to improve form validation. You've surely booked something online before. Perhaps it was tickets to a show or accommodation for a holiday. The ability to book things online is super convenient. That's one of the reasons why the Little Lemon restaurant is adding a table booking system to their website. By now you should know that a HTML form will be an ideal solution for that. Like most restaurants, Little Lemon has different table sizes and different sections in the restaurant where customers can be seated. Therefore, the HTML form must allow customers to decide between the available table sizes, as well as if they want to sit indoors or outdoors. Since both choices have limited options available, it will be best to use radio buttons for the input. Radio buttons are ideal for this form because they allow me to set up groups of options of which only one option in the group can be selected. Now let's explore how to set up a HTML form with radio buttons. I've opened Visual Studio Code and added a new file called booking.html. I've set up the basic HTML structure and added a form element. First, I'll add 2 field set elements, one for the table size and one for location. The field set element defines a group for the radio buttons. Without the field set elements, all radio buttons will belong to the same group, but for this form, we need 2 groups. On the first field set element, I set the ID attribute to size. On the second field set element, I set the ID attribute to location. Below the field set elements, I add a button element. On the button element, I set the type attribute to submit. Inside the element, I add the text book table. There are 3 different table sizes available at Little Lemon: 2-person, 4-person, and 6-person tables. Inside the first field set element, I add 3 input elements representing the 3 different table sizes. On the first input element, I set the type attribute to radio and the value attribute to 2. I then set the name attribute to size. It is important to set the name attribute value to match the value of the ID attribute in the field set. This tells the browser which field set the input belongs to. After the element, I add the text 2-person table. On the second input element, I set the type attribute to radio and the value attribute to 4. I then set the name attribute to size. After the element, I add the text 4-person table. Since the 4-person table is the most common booking, I want to have this option selected by default. To do this, I add the checked attribute to this input element. On the third input element, I set the type attribute to radio and the value attribute to 6. I then set the name attribute to size. After the element, I add the text 6-person table. In the second field set element, I add 2 input elements representing the table location at the restaurant. On the first input element, I set the type attribute to radio and the value attribute to indoors. I then set the name attribute to location, matching the ID of the second field set element. Since the indoor booking is the most common, I'll add the checked attribute to this input element so that it is selected by default. On the second input element, I set the type attribute to radio and the value attribute to outdoors. Again, I set the name attribute to location. I save the file and open it in live preview. Success! The form is set up correctly. Let's test it. If I choose an option for the table size and then choose a different option, my previous choice is deselected. The table location field behaves the same. I can only choose indoors or outdoors. However, I'm testing this form on a laptop with a large screen. On a mobile device with a way smaller screen, it may be difficult for the user to accurately select the small button elements. Luckily, there is a way to improve this by setting the text and button as the input area. I open booking.html again. For each input element and text, I wrap them in a label element, which will group the text with the input element. I save the file again and return to live preview. If I click on the text now, the corresponding input element is selected. Selecting the desired choice will be much easier on a mobile device now. A user will be able to select the button specifically. This form has a much better user experience now. In this video, you've covered how to use radio buttons to create a simple online booking form. Hopefully, Little Lemon will get a lot more table bookings now. The Little Lemon restaurant is becoming very popular in their local area, so much so that a second Little Lemon restaurant opened in another nearby area. Because of this, they want to update their online booking form. They've also added some new table sizes to the restaurant, so they want to replace the table size field on the form with a field for the number of people instead. They also don't need the table location field anymore. And finally, they want customers to be able to choose which restaurant they want to book at. The owners of the restaurant hope for continued success and growth of the business, so the form should allow for more restaurant locations to be added as the business expands. To make all these improvements to the booking form, you'll need to learn how to add advanced HTML features to a form. And that is exactly what this video will cover. Let's explore how to add the calendar, range and data list input types. I open booking.html in Visual Studio Code. I'll start by deleting the previous table and location fields. I then add 3 div elements for the new fields. Next, I'll add the field for the booking date. Luckily, HTML provides a built-in field type called date that will present a calendar to the customer when the field is clicked. To add this, I add an input element to the first div element and set its type attribute to date. I also set the ID and name attributes to booking_date. To provide a good user experience, I'll add a label element before the input element. Inside the label element, I add the text description, booking date. I also add the for attribute and set its value to booking_date so that accessibility software can describe the purpose of the input field to its users. Next, I'll add the field for the number of people. The restaurant has told me that the maximum booking is 10 people, so I'll use the range input type. The range input type allows me to specify the minimum and maximum values of the field. I add an input element to the second div element. I set its type attribute to range. I also set its ID and name attributes to booking_people. To set the minimum value, I add the attribute min, which is short for minimum, and set its value to 1. Then, to set the maximum value, I add the attribute max, which is short for maximum, and set its value to 10. Since a 4-person booking is the most common, I'll set the value attribute to 4 so that it will be set to 4 when the form initially loads. But a slider isn't much use without displaying its value. I add an output element after the input element and set its text content to 4 to match the default value of the input element. The output element is a semantic HTML element that contains a result of a calculation. In this case, I want it to display the value of the slider. To do this, I'll add a small piece of JavaScript code to the input element. I add the onInput attribute and set its value to this.nextElement sibling.value equals this.value. This small piece of code will update the output element with the value of the slider when it changes. Again, to provide a good user experience, I add a label before the element and set its content to number of people. I then set the for attribute to booking_people. Now I'll add the new location field. The restaurant currently has 2 locations, but they said they might add more later. To allow for expansion later, I'll use a data list input type. The data list input type allows me to specify a list of available options that will appear in a drop-down list. There can be tens and hundreds of options, so the field allows the user to begin typing and it will narrow down the available options based on their input. Since there are only 2 locations so far, the customer will be able to select their location from the drop-down list. When more locations are added later, the customer will be able to begin typing their location and quickly select their location from a reduced set of options. Setting up the data list input type requires a few more steps than the other input types. First, I add an input element. Then I set the name and ID attributes to booking_location. Then I add an attribute called list and set its value to locations. This value is important for the next step. I then add a data list element and set the ID attribute to match the value of the list attribute on the input element. In this case, I set the ID attribute to locations. Inside the data list element, I then add 2 option elements. On the first option element, I add the value attribute and set it to downtown. On the second option element, I add the value attribute and set it to uptown. Again, to provide a good user experience, I add a label before the input element and set its content to location. I then set the for attribute to booking_location. I save the file and open it in live preview. When I click on the date field, the browser opens a calendar and allows me to select a date. The range input type is presented as a slider that I can slide left and right to the value I want. And finally, the data list input allows me to select an option for the location or begin typing to narrow down the available options. With the continued success of Little Lemon, I'm sure I'll be updating this form again in the near future. In this video, you've learned how to use advanced features of HTML forms. You should now be able to add a calendar, create a slider with values, and add a data list that allows users to either select an option from a drop-down list or by typing their input. When ordering products online, you fill out your address and your credit card number. Then you click on an order button that confirms your order. Because you are learning more about front-end development, you might be wondering what exactly happens when you click on that order button. In this video, you will learn what happens when forms are submitted in the web browser. By now, you know that the web browser communicates with a web server using a HTTP request-response cycle. This means that the web browser sends requests to the web server and the web server sends back a response. Up to now, the main type of requests you've been introduced to were for resources such as HTML documents, images, CSS files, and JavaScript files. But it is also possible to send data as part of a request. This is how forms send data to the web server. In fact, there are 2 ways a form can send data to the web server, using the HTTP GET method or the HTTP POST method. You can specify which method the form should use with the method attribute of the form element. Let's examine an example form and see how the data can be sent using the 2 different methods. This login form accepts a username and password. It also has a login button that submits the form to the web server. So how would it work if the method attribute is set to GET? When the login button is clicked, the form data is sent as part of the request URL. This means that the user data is appended to the end of the URL in the web browser navigation bar. The web server receives the HTTP GET request and extracts the form data from the URL. While this is an easy way to submit data, it has 3 key problems. First, the length of a URL is limited to around 2,000 characters depending on the web browser you are using. Some web browsers allow more, but there are inconsistencies between browsers. So, if you have a large form, some data may be lost when it's sent via the GET method to the web server. Second, the length of a requested URL is also limited on some web servers. Popular web server software such as Apache Web Server or Nginx have a default limit of around 4,096 characters. So again, if you have a large form, some data may be lost. The final problem is security. Since the data is included as part of the URL, it means that your data is stored in your web browser history and possibly in the request logs on the web server. If you're transmitting personal information such as addresses or credit card numbers, this is a major privacy and security risk. Now let's focus on how the form would work if we set the method attribute to post. When the form is submitted using the post method, the form data is inserted into the content of the HTTP request. When the submit button is pressed, it will send an HTTP post request with the data contained in the body of the request. The HTTP post method is more secure than the HTTP get method. However, the data could still be read by a third party listening to the HTTP request. To secure this completely, HTTPS is used to encrypt the data so that only the sender and receiver can understand the data. Once the web server receives the request, it processes it and sends back a HTTP response. If the request was successful, the response will direct the web browser to a new web page. If errors occurred, there are many ways this can be handled by the web page, as explained in a previous video. You should now be familiar with how forms are sent to web servers and the difference between get and post. An important part of being a front-end developer is to provide a good user experience on the websites and web applications that you develop. And that includes ensuring that users can complete HTML forms without issues. There are many web browsers available today for browsing the World Wide Web. However, each one is developed by a different company using different technologies. As a result, you will find that your HTML forms will appear differently when you view them on different web browsers. But a form may even appear differently on the same browser when you view the form on a Windows PC or a Mac. This makes the creation of a consistent user experience challenging. In this video, you will explore how form elements display differently on various web browsers and how to solve this problem. First, let's focus on the most common form element, the input element. The same input type HTML code displays differently in web browsers such as Firefox, Microsoft Edge, Chrome, and Safari. For example, there are subtle differences in the height and corners of the input box. There is also a difference in the default input box widths of Firefox and Safari compared to other browsers like Microsoft Edge and Chrome. Safari on Mac OS differs a lot from the other browsers, using a thinner border and regular corners. Next, let's explore the checkbox input type. Again, the exact same input type HTML code will let the checkbox display differently in a checked and unchecked state in different browsers. Notice that Microsoft Edge uses a grey color in the checked state while the other web browsers use blue. Even still, each browser is using a different shade of blue. Also notice how the border of the checkbox varies between each web browser. Safari's checkbox is also smaller than the other. Now that you've explored how HTML form elements can appear inconsistently across different web browsers, let's focus on how to solve this. As you know, CSS allows you to define the visual styling of HTML elements. Defining CSS rules for the different HTML form elements will ensure that your element is styled consistently across web browsers. For example, you can use element selectors to select the different element types and apply CSS properties to them. It's also possible to style the individual input types using CSS rules. You can add a CSS rule using the element selector. To select the input HTML element, use the input element selector. And then specify the individual styling by adding a pair of square brackets, and then type equals, in this case text, or email. Then apply CSS properties to set the font, width, height, and border. If you specify styling with CSS in this way, the individual elements of your forms will display consistently across browsers. Luckily, there are a lot of resources that simplify the styling of forms. Popular libraries and frameworks such as Bootstrap, Tailwind CSS, and Foundation provide CSS rules for forms and ensure visual consistency across different devices and browsers. You should now know why it is important to pay attention to the appearance of different HTML elements across web browsers and how you can ensure consistency with CSS rules. These days, it's difficult to think of using the internet without streaming music or videos, but this wasn't always possible on the World Wide Web. How do you, as a developer, add videos and audio to a web page? Luckily, it's quite straightforward. thanks to HTML and modern web browsers. HTML video and audio tags are used for embedding media on a web page, and both tags support different file types that can be played in the web browser. For videos, the following file types are supported by most web browsers: MP4, WebM, and OGG. For audio, the following file types are supported by most web browsers: MP3, WAV, and OGG. Let's examine how to use the video tag. You start with the video tag itself. Then you add a source element. Note that the source element has no closing tag. In the source element, you add two attributes: src, also known as source, and type. In the src attribute, you add the address of the video file. In this case, it's linked to a file named dance.mp4. In the type attribute, you add the value video/mp4 since the file is an mp4 file. Remember I mentioned that the file types are supported by most web browsers. In case the file type is not supported, the video tag allows for multiple sources to be specified. The web browser will check through the sources and use the first one that it supports. If you prefer the web browser to use one format over another, then make sure to specify them in the preferred order. There are also attributes available for the video tag itself which allow you to customize the video player. For example, you can specify the width and height of the player using the width and height attributes. If you want to enable player controls, such as a pause and volume button, you can add the controls attribute. There are other attributes available to customize the video player too. You'll learn more about these in a later video. Now let's examine how the audio tag works. Similar to the video tag, you start with the opening and closing audio tags. And just like the video tag, you specify the source element with its src and type attributes. And if the web browser doesn't support the file type, it can fall back on a different type. It's important to note that if you're using an MP3 file, that the type is specified as audio/MPEG. This is because MP3 is short for MPEG-1 audio layer 3. Like the video player, you can also customize the audio player. By using the controls attribute, you can enable player controls such as the pause and volume buttons. And now you know how to add and customize both a video player and an audio player. Well done! You'll learn about other video and audio attributes in the next video.
The Little Lemon restaurant wants to add an About page to their website. They've asked me to set up the page and include some audio and video in embedded players. I've set up my basic HTML document structure in a file named about.html. I start off by adding the heading tag containing the text About. I then add a paragraph element containing the About text provided to me by the restaurant. Next, I add the audio element after the paragraph element. Inside the audio element, I add the source element and set the src attribute to music.ogg. Then I set the type attribute to audio/OGG. They also ask that the audio should loop, so when the audio player reaches the end of the audio, it should automatically go back and play it again from the start. To do this, I add the loop attribute to the audio element. I also need to add controls so that the user can play and pause the audio. To do this, I add the controls attribute to the audio element. I save the file and open the web page in my browser. I can see that the audio is loading and is displayed in the browser using the browser's built-in audio player. Pressing the play button starts the audio, and pressing pause will pause it. Everything is working as expected. Now I'll add the video. I add a video element before the paragraph element. Inside the video element, I add the source element and set the src attribute to video.mp4. I then set the type attribute to video/mp4. I want to reserve the appropriate amount of space on the web page for the video, so I go back to the video element and set the width attribute to 320 and the height attribute to 240. To provide a good user experience, I'll also enable the video controls. To do this, I add the controls attribute to the video element. I save the file again and open the page in my browser. The video appears and I can click on the play button to start the video. However, the restaurant requested that the audio of the video should be disabled by default. To do this, I go back to my HTML and add the muted attribute to the video element. I save the file again and open the page. And everything is working as expected. That's great. The About page is a great addition to the Little Lemon website for customers wanting to learn more about the business. Using embedded players is a good way to make your web page more interactive. And luckily, these players can support either audio or video. What's more, you can add controls to allow the user to decide what they want to do. These audio and video players are sure to grab customers' attention when they browse the About page.
Have you ever visited a website with a map, video, or social media post contained in the web page? Now that you're learning about HTML, you may have wondered how that's done. Well, it's done using something called an iframe. An iframe is a HTML element that allows you to place or embed content from another website into a web page. It's defined using the iframe HTML tag. How it works is that it embeds another browsing instance inside the page. What this means is that it runs the embedded web page similar to how a web page runs in another tab of your web browser. Therefore, it's running the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript of the embedded web page. An iframe is often used to display adverts, but it can also be used to embed content from another website, such as a social media post. The content that's embedded is defined using the src attribute. The value of the attribute is the URL of the content. It's also possible to set the width and height of an iframe using the width and height attributes. While iframe is very useful, its security has been a concern since its inception because it's vulnerable to malicious code and injection. As previously mentioned, a web page can run JavaScript code, so it's important to ensure that you trust the website you're embedding into your own. Fortunately, there are some attributes that can be applied to limit the behavior of the iframe. The first attribute is the allow attribute, which limits which browser features the iframe can access. There are many possible values that can be set on the allow attribute. For now, let's examine how to disable camera and microphone access in an iframe. On your iframe element, you add the allow attribute and set its value to camera none and microphone none. Now that was easy. The second attribute to improve security is the sandbox attribute. Similar to the allow attribute, there are many values that can be set. The sandbox attribute limits behavior within the iframe, such as preventing files from being downloaded and preventing pop-up windows. For now, the important thing to know is that when the sandbox attribute is used with an empty value, all sandbox restrictions will apply to the iframe. Individual sandbox restrictions can be removed by adding attributes. For example, if you want to allow file downloads in the iframe, you would allow the allow downloads value. While these restrictions help to keep your users secure, there may still be security vulnerabilities in your web browser that the embedded web page can exploit. Therefore, it's always best to be cautious when using iframes and ensure that you trust the website that you are embedding.
The Little Lemon restaurant has partnered with another restaurant for cross-promotional purposes. The other restaurant wants to be able to change the images in the campaign throughout the coming year based on their current promotions. To support this, I've been asked to set up an iframe on the main page of the website. The other restaurant specifically asked for an iframe to be used because it means that they can update their promotional image on the Little Lemon website without needing to contact me first. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to do that. I've opened index.html in Visual Studio Code. First, I add the iframe element. The other restaurant didn't provide the URL for the promotional image, so for now, I'll embed a placeholder image that they did provide. To do this, I add an src attribute to the iframe element and set its value to placeholder.png. The image will always be 320 pixels by 128 pixels in size, so I'll need to set the iframe to the same size. I add the width attribute to the iframe element and set its value to 320. I then add the height attribute and set its value to 128. I save the file and open it in the web browser. The image is correctly placed on the web page. When the other restaurant provides the final URL of the advertisement, I can update the SRC attribute of the element. However, the Little Lemon restaurant has expressed security concerns about embedding content, especially now that they have online ordering and customers interacting with their website. Their concerns are valid, as there are many security vulnerabilities with embedding content from another website. To address these concerns, I've decided to sandbox and limit the capabilities of the iframe element. I open my index.html file again. I then add the sandbox attribute to the iframe element. This will prevent any JavaScript files running within the iframe and restrict many browser capabilities within the iframe context, such as submitting forms and allowing pop-up windows. Next, I'll add the allow attribute. The allow attribute accepts multiple values, and the values are separated by semicolons. I want to disable several browser features for the iframe. These include payment, microphone, and camera access. In the allow attribute, I first add the word payment followed by a space character, then a single quote, the word none, and another single quote to disable payments. I then add a semicolon. Next, I add the word camera and again a space followed by the word none in single quotes. This will disable camera access. I then add another semicolon. Finally, I add the word microphone and again add a space followed by the word none in single quotes. This will disable microphone access. I save the file and open it in the web browser. Great, the iframe still works and it's now more secure. The iframe I created is now secure thanks to the restrictions I've placed on it. First, I added the sandbox attribute to restrict certain browser capabilities, and then I used the allow attribute to disable some potentially unsecured browser features. Now that they know it's secure, the other restaurant is going to implement the same code on their website. Hopefully, this will lead to a lot more business for both restaurants.
You've most likely played a video game or watched an animation in your web browser before. Perhaps you've wondered how it works. Well, in this video, you'll be introduced to the basics of graphics programming in the web browser. There are many authoring tools available to produce animated and video game content for the web browser, but all of these are underpinned by one of four technologies: GIF, WebP, 2D Canvas, and WebGL. The graphics interchange format, or GIF, along with the WebP image format are used for animated images. An image using this format has no interactivity, but it's popular for embedding animated content and for building 2D video games and animations. The 2D canvas allows 2D graphics to be drawn in the web browser. It's popular for building 2D video games and animations. The logic and behavior of an animation or video game is defined using JavaScript. But what about 3D graphics? WebGL is a popular technology for building 2D and 3D animations and advanced graphics. The benefit of WebGL is that a dedicated chip in your device called a graphics processing unit, or GPU, does the calculations when graphics are rendered to the screen. This allows for complex calculations such as lighting simulation and rendering massive 3D worlds. It is important to note that while WebGL will always use the GPU, it's not guaranteed that the 2D canvas will use the GPU. This will depend on the web browser implementation. WebGL is a complex technology and requires a lot of background information. So for now, let's focus on the canvas element. Let's examine how to animate some simple graphics using the 2D canvas. I'm going to animate a bouncing ball. I've opened Visual Studio Code and I've set up two files, index.html and animation.js. Inside index.html, I have added the canvas HTML element. I have set its width attribute to 640 and its height attribute to 480. I have also set its ID attribute to my_canvas so that I can access the element in my JavaScript code. After the canvas element, I have a script element with its SRC attribute set to animation.js. I now open animation.js. At the beginning of the file, I look up the canvas element using the document.getElementById function and pass in my _canvas at the parameter. The result is stored in a variable named canvas. Next, I look up the 2D canvas context using canvas.getContext and pass in the parameter 2D. The result is stored in a variable named context. Below this, I define some variables to track the speed, position, movement, and radius of the bouncing ball. Next, I define a function called moveBall. It is responsible for moving the ball across the screen and changing its direction once it reaches the left or right side of the screen. After that, I define a function called drawBall. The function clears the canvas area using context.clearRec. It then draws the ball in its current position using the context.beginPath, context.arc, and context.fill functions. Finally, I define an animate function, which calls the moveBall and drawBall functions. After doing this, it then calls window.requestAnimationFrame to schedule the animate function to be called again. At the end of the file, I call window.requestAnimationFrame to start the animate function being called. Using a small amount of JavaScript code, I've animated a bouncing ball. This is a straightforward example of the capabilities of the 2D canvas. There are many more possibilities to develop animations in video games, and there are also many libraries available to simplify development. These are linked in the additional resources reading. You've reached the end of this module on HTML. It's now time to review what you've learned in these lessons. You began this module by exploring the question, how is HTML and CSS used in the real world? You learned about the role of a HTML and CSS developer, what entry-level jobs and career paths are available to you, and what a day in the life of a developer looks like, and who you'd work with as a HTML and CSS developer. You also learned what the relationship is between HTML and CSS, how HTML and CSS are continually improving, and how HTML and CSS usage has gone beyond desktop PCs. Next, you learned about semantic and meta tags. You should now be able to recognize how and why semantic tags are used, use basic semantic tags, and have an appreciation of the structured approach needed to produce a well-formed web page. You also explored the topics of metadata and meta tags using templates, layout design, and social media cards. Following your exploration of these topics, you should now be able to explain why metadata and meta tags are used, add basic Open Graph Protocol meta tags to HTML documents, and demonstrate the application of the OG protocol when setting up a social media card. You then moved on to study user input and forms. This topic included learning about forms and validation, client-side validation, form submission, radio buttons, and browser differences. You learned how to create and test a basic form, identify the potential of HTML validation types, and explain how forms send data to the web server. In addition, you should now be able to demonstrate the use of radio buttons and explain how to ensure that forms display consistently across browsers. Following this introduction to user input and forms, you then covered media elements. This topic included video and audio, embedded players, iframes, and the canvas element. You should now be able to embed video and audio in a web page, create a video and audio player that can rate the media played, recognize the purpose of the iframe tag and learn to identify and mitigate security risks when using the iframe tag, and identify the uses of the canvas element. You should now be familiar with the basics of HTML. You now know more about the role of a HTML and CSS developer and the kinds of things you'll be doing when working as one, like using semantic tags to construct a well-formed web page, or how to use inputs and forms, or embed videos and audio. Well done, you're making good progress on your learning journey. CSS, or Cascading Style Sheets, is a set of rules that enhance the appearance of web pages. In the early years of the internet, browsers adopted CSS because it presented an opportunity for better visual designs and more creativity. As browsers continue to develop and grow beyond traditional devices, CSS's capabilities developed in parallel. This development includes the introduction of responsive design in CSS and has further grown from there with layout options such as flexboxes, grids, and boxes. And you could argue that layouts is one of the most important components of designing a good web page, because layouts help divide a page into different sections, thus making the page more presentable. So let's learn more about CSS web layouts. CSS can be used to enhance a web page by modifying fonts, colors, layout, size, and other style formatting options that make the web page more presentable. The browser window that is visible to the user on the screen is called the viewport. In essence, the idea behind any CSS web layout is to create an optimally designed web page that has a good viewport at any given point. In other words, CSS layouts are all about how the content of your web page is organized. When it comes to creating layouts using CSS, an important property is the display property. What does it do, you ask? The display property specifies the type of box that you want to use for a given HTML element. You might remember from an earlier course that the display property determines if a rendered box is inline or block. Box models allocate rectangles or boxes to HTML elements so CSS rules can be applied. For example, the relative CSS rule for a HTML element with an ID named sample would contain display property with a block value. The code changes the property of the display box to a block type. Layouts created using the block type are good, but evolving requirements led to the development of CSS web layouts such as Flexbox and Grid, which help create rules for multiple elements. They added more flexibility and dimensionality with better options for fine-tuning specific sections of a web page. The main difference between the two is that Flexbox is one-dimensional, while Grid, as the word implies, is two-dimensional. You will examine these in more detail over the course of the module, but for now, let's just do a brief overview. Flexbox is short for Flexible Box Model, and it was introduced before the Grid layout. For example, the Flexbox property with an ID named sample contains the display property with flex as its value. Flexbox adds responsiveness to CSS with float elements and positioning. One-dimensional refers to the fact that a given Flexbox container will arrange items in either a column or a row along its axis. The Flexbox container applied over an element can flex to shrink or expand, thus resulting in a flexible, responsive design. CSS Grid is similar to the Flexbox, except it creates a two-dimensional grid along both the row and column axes. For example, the grid rules for the sample ID can be added after adding the display property with the grid as its value. While the grid increases dimensionality and helps to create an advanced layout with relative ease, it can also lead to increased complications later if the element rules are not systematically defined. There is no strict rule on choosing which layout to use, but in general, Flexboxes are more suitable when you want to create flexible elements in smaller spaces, while grids are more suitable to large-scale layouts. A separate explanation of each type of layout has been given in this video, but in practice you'll likely encounter the use of more than one layout in rendering a single page. The rules for these layouts in CSS are standardized, but that doesn't mean you are limited when it comes to creativity, aesthetics, or optimization when designing a web page. You will learn more about how to use these layouts during the course. At this stage, you should be familiar with different layouts and grid structures, and you should be ready to start using Flexbox. Let's explore a few practical examples of how you can use it. In the next few minutes, you will explore what the three most common uses of Flexbox are. As mentioned earlier, Flexboxes are more suitable to use for simple layouts or designing simple elements in a page. In line with that idea, let's explore a few commonly used design elements that you see on a page. You will discover simple ways in which you can utilize Flexboxes for binding elements together or creating an easy layout. Let's explore the three most common uses of Flexboxes in CSS. The first application of Flexbox that you will cover that is commonly used is a search bar. You can use Flex in search bars because it ties up all the elements, such as the small search icon, the search input area, and the submit button. Next, you can create the navigation bar using Flex, which consists of several different layouts. And it makes your navigation bar highly responsive on different devices. Finally, another type of Flexbox that is commonly used is an image gallery. Flex is helpful here as it can realign itself as you change the size of the window. In the next few minutes, you will discover how to create these Flexboxes to ensure a simple layout. In the first example of a Flexbox file, I will create a search bar. I add a reference to the CSS file in the head section of the HTML page. After that, I add content inside the body section of our HTML code. I first create a container class with a div tag. Inside this container, I have three different elements, which are the search icon, the search box where I type my search, and finally the submit button. In the CSS code, I first write rules for the container, then for the search icon, the search box, and finally for the button. Most of the properties defined here are settings for the alignment of the selectors. There are just a few important things to take note of. The display property I use is inline flex instead of flex, which makes the flex container behave like an inline element. Another property to take note of is the overflow. The overflow property clips the overflowing content, which in this case will be the text I enter in the search query. Then I add the properties for the icon and the search box. Finally, I add the properties for the search button. Let's remove this CSS code momentarily to check how the output displays without it. Although all the elements are there, the page is standard and plain. I add the code back to the CSS file and check the output one more time. Now the search box displays the properties that I defined in my CSS file. Notice that when I change the size of the page, the search area doesn't change. Another place where Flexbox is used quite frequently is in navigation menus. In this case, I created an unordered list that consists of 4 items. Notice that in my CSS code, I use something called a star or universal selector. The universal selector applies the rules to every element in my CSS code. I use this to clear any formatting that is browser specific. Now I define the rules for the container. It's important to notice that I use the flex flow, which is a shorthand property specifying the direction of the flex container and its behavior for wrapping. Another important property is justify content, which aligns the flexible container's items along the main axis. In this case, I have set it to stretch. Since the individual elements are part of the container, I applied the rules both to the container and to the element, which are the list items, anchor tag, and so on. It's also important to notice that the page is responsive. So, as the size of the browser window gets smaller, the items stack on top of each other, and if I expand the window, it changes to a standard horizontal navigation menu. One final Flexbox example that I will demonstrate is a responsive image gallery. All the elements for the gallery is in the body of the HTML file. There is a div element with a class container that consists of 6 images that are saved inside the project folder. Now let's open the CSS file. First, I remove all browser-specific settings that may be there by using the star selector, just like I did earlier. I set the value of both the margin and the padding to 0. I then reset the basic alignment options for the images by setting the border to 0. Next, let's focus on the container. First, I set the value of display to flex. Then I add the flex wrap property, which determines whether the flex items should be forced in one line or should wrap over multiple lines. Next, I justify the content property, which aligns the flexible container items on the horizontal main axis. I set it to space dash between. Finally, I add some padding. Let's inspect the output. The output window is narrow at the moment, so the 6 images are stacked on top of each other, but when I expand the window, they spread out. One can notice the effect better in a browser, so I copy the link and paste it into my browser. When I change the size of the browser window, it is clear that the alignment of these images is responsive. These are just some of the ways in which you use Flexboxes to provide responsiveness to websites and bind different elements together on web pages. You should now be more familiar with some simple ways in which you can use Flexboxes to bind elements together to create an easy, responsive layout on your web page. Good job! So far, you've covered different ways in which a Flexbox can be used to add functionality to a web page. In this video, you're going to explore the versatility of Flexboxes even further by using them to create bar charts. Bar charts are a common way of visualizing data used in statistics. It's easier to compare and understand data when viewing it in the form of rectangular bars that have heights in proportion to the values they represent. The different bars stacked alongside represent the classifying criteria. There are sophisticated data visualization tools available today that support web pages, but it's fairly straightforward to integrate data using CSS. CSS provides a straightforward way to do this by using Flexbox. With Flexboxes, you can generate both vertical and horizontal bar charts. These bar charts are called flex charts. The most important property when using Flex is the Flex property that in turn has the following 3 sub-properties. Flex grow, which specifies how much the item will grow compared to other flexible items. Flex shrink, which specifies how much the item will shrink compared to other flexible items. And flex basis, which specifies the initial length of the flexible item. Flex property can be declared with something called a shorthand notation, such as flex 0, 1 auto, where 0, 1 and auto are the default values for the flex grow, flex shrink and flex basis property. Let me demonstrate each of these types with the help of an example. Clients visiting the Little Lemon restaurant were given a survey to pick their preferred dish. The management of Little Lemon decided to publish the results on their website to draw attention to their most popular dishes. I've been asked to write code to make this possible. I've set up my basic HTML document structure in a file named flexcharts.html. I begin by creating a class called row by writing .row and pressing enter to get the div tag. This will be a horizontal group across the page that will display the result. I create two tags inside the div tag, one for the label and another for displaying the results of the survey. To add the label, I type .label on a new line and press enter. I then add the name of the label, preferred dishes. Next, I create another class called container by typing .container and then I press enter. Inside the container, I create a class called dish by typing .dish and pressing enter. As there are 3 dishes in the popular list, I copy and paste this item twice. To distinguish between the dishes, I add a class name for each of the items after the word dish. I name item 1 pasta, item 2 pizza, and item 3 burrito. I now have to add styling properties. As I am using flex basis, in item 1, I add flex basis as the property to specify the initial length of the item. I add the percentage to indicate the length of this flex item. I do the same for the other 2 items. As the total here should be 100, I adjust the percentages of item 2 and 3. Finally, I add the respective labels for each dish. To do this, I add the percentage between the angle brackets at the end of each item. Now that my code is created, I move to CSS by clicking on the flexcharts.css file at the top of my screen and checking that it's referencing the correct file. I have stacked the CSS file next to the HTML file for better understanding. I start with the outermost container, which is row, by typing .row and then pressing enter. Within row, I add the display property, to which I add flex. I press enter to move to a new line. I add another property called align items, to which I add stretch. There are 2 main axes in flex, the main axis that runs horizontally across the page and the cross axis that runs vertically. Align items controls the alignment along the cross axis. Next, I address the label div tag, which consists of the flex property and the font family. Flex, as you previously learned, is shorthand for flex grow, flex shrink and flex basis. Since this label is a part of the row, I add .row in front of .label. Now I add the container that will consist of all the results of the survey. I defined only the flex code value here. Just like align items, the justify content property defines how the browser distributes across the main axis of the flex container. So here I set the alignment to flex start, which is the left-hand corner of my web page. Next, I define the property for the dish selector. It is the same as for the container above, but here the alignments are centered. This will become clear once you see the results. I have one more set of selectors to define, but first let me display the output. To do this, I switch to my HTML file and click on the display icon in the top right corner of my screen. The output, preferred dishes, and the percentages 35, 50, and 15 appear on my screen. To improve the visuals of my chart and make it easier to interpret, I'm going to add individual colors to the chart items. At the bottom of my CSS file, I press enter twice and type .pasta. I press enter, and within this div class, I add background color, followed by the hex code of the color I want to use. In the next line, I specify the background color of pizza. Lastly, I specify the background color of burrito. Once again, I display the output. Now the percentages display the background colors as indicated. What's important to note here is that as you change the size of the web page, the flex adjusts itself while the label remains unchanged. The next example is very similar to the one I created for the earlier bar charts. In this example, when I create horizontal objects, I first add 4 containers for male and female, and then I set the flex basis for each of them. If you look at my CSS code, I follow the same order. First, I address the columns, which is the outermost container, then the class container, and after that, the div class bar inside it. And finally, the individual properties that I want to define for male and female. The main differences here are in terms of the line items, justify content, and flex selection that have been adjusted to accommodate the horizontal bar charts. When I display the output of this code, the male and female classes are stacked on top of each other. What alignment to use may or may not come intuitively, but if you look at a few more examples, it will start making sense. Like in this case, the container contains male and female classes that need to be stacked on top of each other, which is why I have used flex direction. That was a lot of information about the many uses of flex boxes, so you should have a good idea of how to use them in your own coding now. The graphical representation of information or data makes it accessible and allows you to see and understand trends and patterns. In this video, you've explored ways to create bar charts using Flexbox. CSS grid layouts are important when it comes to designing a good web page. This is because layouts are a way to provide visual cues for a user by organizing relevant content to make it easier to comprehend. So let's learn more about layouts. When someone says the word grid, you probably think of lines that cross each other to form squares or rectangles. CSS grids are two-dimensional design layouts that are responsive and compatible with browser variations. They are an alternative to other options such as flexboxes and tables, especially when you are working with larger scale layouts. Columns are the vertical tracks and rows are the horizontal tracks in your viewport. Grids divide the page into rows and columns, and the space between these tracks are called gutters or gaps. And a cell is the space in a grid container where a row and column intersect. There are several different configurations you can add to define and modify grids. Let's examine an example that uses a HTML document to demonstrate how to iteratively make changes to a grid. First, let's create a HTML document called index.html. Right now, the contents displayed in the viewport are just a vertical series of letters from A to E without any styling. Let's start adding content to the CSS file. The first thing to do is set the values for the properties of the different box classes inside the container object to make the layout look more presentable. The letters now have a better visual design, but their arrangement on screen is unchanged. The result is that each letter occupies more screen space than is necessary for its size. What's displayed in the viewport may appear to be a grid, but it's not actually one. It's just the default settings of CSS for a layout. Once you convert this into the grid layout, you'll be able to recognize the flexibility it can add. So let's convert it into a grid layout. Set the properties of the container class by first assigning a grid value to the display property. The display property is also used to set display types for other designs such as flex, block, inline, and so on, and it's usually a part of container elements inside our code. The updated container now has the display property value set to grid and the property values configured for 3 columns and 2 rows. That's 2 changes from the previous configuration. Let's examine them. The grid template columns property has been added into the CSS code to set the size of each of the 3 columns using pixel values. The use of FR, which is an abbreviation for fraction, has been introduced. Fraction effectively divides the grid, and the page now displays 5 separate grid cells around the letters, which are arranged in 3 columns and 2 rows. Where applied, the grid tracks are divided proportionately to the ratio of all the fraction values present. As there are 2 rows, the defined values are sized in the ratio of 2 to 1. Fraction adds flexibility to the grid without needing to deal with actual pixel sizes. It must be noted, though, that fraction and pixel sizes can be used interchangeably with both rows and columns. Now to add a couple of properties such as grid gap or gutter and background color to define the grid. The updated view displays a red box representing the grid because that's what the background color's RGB value was set to. The grid stretches by default the entire width of the page. And the size of the grid track or gutter has been adjusted to 10 pixels, which leaves more space between the grid cells. You can also opt to use the auto properties such as grid auto rows and grid auto columns, collectively called the implicit grid. Let's replace the grid template rows property in the code with grid auto rows. All the rows are now auto resized to 100 pixels. Now let's examine some of the functions that can make configuring the layout easier. First, the repeat function passes the number of repeats required for a given number of rows and columns. The result of the code adjustment is an unchanged web page from the last instance because the repeat function didn't change anything, it just reduced the amount of code you needed to write. Therefore, the repeat function helps reduce redundancy and provides ease of code modification. Next, the min-max function sets the minimum and maximum values expected for the sizes of rows and columns. Let's set the value for the grid auto rows to 150 pixels. The output is modified so that the minimum size of each row is 150 pixels. One more important concept is grid frameworks. There are a number of commonly used grid frameworks and layouts. Two such grid design layouts are known as the 12 and 16 column grids. They divide the page into 12 and 16 tracks respectively along the vertical columns. The properties can be modified accordingly to target a specific track. CSS grid layouts are so important when it comes to good web page design, and this video has demonstrated that layouts provide visual cues for the user by organizing content in a way that makes it easier to understand. Who knows, soon you'll be building your own web pages and you'll be able to test out some of the techniques shown in this video. And don't forget the repeat and min-max functions. They'll save you time and effort.
In this video, you will learn about how differently commonly used grid layouts are created and where you can use them. Let's start by examining the grid layout named the Pancake Stack. I've opened extra.html in Visual Studio Code. Now I can start adding the different elements. First is the restaurant's name, Little Lemon, which I put into the header. Then in the main element I type menu, and for the footer I type About Us. After saving, next I will open up extra.css. First I will write the rules for the body, followed by the header, name, and then the footer. First, for the body, I need to use the display property to code the grid. I define its height as 150 VH. 1 VH is equal to 1% of the viewport height. Now I add the grid template rows property that will track the sizing functions for the grid rows. I set it to 1 FR, or 1 fraction for the main section. Now I define the rules for the header. I start by setting the background color, and follow that up with text alignment, which is centered, and 2 EM padding. 2 EM is a relative height, which is twice the size of the current font height. Let's examine the output. It looks good. I'm going to do the same for the main and the footer elements. I've changed the colors, but everything else is the same. Let's examine the output again. It looks exactly like I was expecting. The header, main, and footer are all formatted in different colors, and if I modify the size of the page, the layout changes accordingly. Next, let's examine the 12-section or 12-column grid system layout, also called a 12-span grid. This type of grid conceptually divides the page into 12 columns of equal size. One can add different elements to the grid by determining their starting point and the number of columns each element spans. Don't worry, this will all become a lot clearer when I go through the following example. I'm opening grid12.html in Visual Studio Code. First, I create a container with class parent, and inside it, I'll add 6 items that I call segments. I add a class name for each of the div tags matching the span or width I'm going to give each of these segments. These widths are randomly assigned. Now I'm going to save and open up my grid12.css file. I'm going to add CSS selectors for each class. I will first add CSS properties for the parent class, and then for the individual segments I defined. For the parent class, I write display grid, and then add the grid template columns property, which I'm going to repeat 12 times with 1 fraction each. Next, I define the properties of the segment. Again, I add display grid, following up with centering the items and the text. Then I set the grid template rows property. I want the segments to be a little wider, so I'll set it to 100 pixels. Let's examine the output. It's not much for now, but let's continue. Now let's set the properties for the different segments. The first one spans 12 columns. I start by adding a light sea green background, and then the next part is important. This is where I use the grid column property. This value tells the element to start from the first column and span all 12 columns. Let's examine the output again. These two segments are now in better shape, starting from the first column and spanning all the way to the 12th. Let's add another selector for 8. Again, I copy the same code, but instead of starting from the first column this time, I'll start from, say, the 5th column, and it'll span across 8 columns. Let's change the color here to bisque. The color now makes it obvious that the element starts from the 5th column and spans 8 columns. Let's add the other segments, and then we'll examine the code again. Alright, let's examine the output again. Now this is looking a lot more presentable. There's also another way to view these columns. Click on More Browser Actions and then on Open DevTools pane. Then you can select the button in the corner to select an element on the page to inspect, then scan over the grid. The page is systematically divided into 12 different columns, and you can configure your code according to your requirements. Grids like these are really useful when it comes to designing something like a magazine, newspaper, or page layout, which can replicate these models. Now you know about the basic grid layout and the 12-column grid.
Websites have to work on a lot of things. Mobile phones, desktop apps, tablets. The idea behind responsive web design is building a product that works across a range of viewports. And there's a lot of techniques to do this, but the core problem is you have a product and it needs to work everywhere. How do you do that? Hi, my name is Benedict Hobart. I am a front-end engineer at Meta. Open a website and then just change the width of the browser window and see what happens to a website. A good responsive website, you'll see maybe you've got a top tab bar that then collapses into a drop-down menu. So that's responsive design. The problem to solve is to make your app work across a range of viewports. There's other considerations as well when you're building an app for different viewports, like if you're building an app to work from a mobile On a mobile device, you might put the action buttons towards the bottom of the screen so you can hit it with your thumb versus, having to use your index finger to hit the drop down at the top right. So it's about being very considered about how you place your functionality and what you think is important. It's about making things work as a first step. And then it's like, how do you make things good? How do you take into account the capabilities of the device you're building for and make it better than it would have been if you just made it work? People have changed the way that they make content from being like, 14 by 9, whatever, 10 viewport width people used to watch content on. And they flipped it horizontally because that's personal when you take a photo of something like that. It feels like you're there. It feels like you're talking to them. That's how you FaceTime your friends. It's good to be aware of how you can, how your products make people feel. And that's sort of like the never-ending game of like how people are using your products. You make something and you have no idea how people are going to use it, but that's the fun part. Maintaining quality is hard. People have QA teams that they employ to make sure that apps are functional for a certain width. People might write end-to-end tests to make sure that things keep functioning as they could be. It's hard to know what's going to change in the technology until it happens. And then you're like, okay, I need to redesign my website because iPhone just came out with a new screen resolution. So be aware of when your website breaks. The goal isn't to make it work for a phone and a desktop and a TV. The goal is to just make it always work. And if you make it work across, a width from here all the way down to here, you're probably in a good spot. Instead of focusing on making that device work properly, try to make your interface fluid and work across a range of dimensions versus just ticking the boxes.
Earlier, you learned about the different types of CSS selectors. Remember, CSS selectors correspond to specific elements or element groups in a HTML document. In this video, you will learn about additional commonly used CSS selectors. But before you explore them, let's briefly revise the ones you've already covered. You learned about element or type selectors. The element selector allows developers to select HTML elements based on their element type. You also get ID selectors. ID selectors use the ID attribute of a HTML element. Since the ID is unique within a web page, it allows the developer to select a specific element for styling. You were also introduced to class selectors. Class selectors allow you to select elements based on the class attribute applied to them. With class selectors, you can apply rules to all elements with the specified class name. Those are the CSS selectors you have learned about previously. Hopefully, you've experienced how useful and effective they can be. But that's not all. As the CSS codebase evolved over time, more selectors were added to improve the design and styling effect of CSS. Let's explore a few of these widely used selectors. First, let's focus on attribute selectors. The attribute selector has a few syntax variations. Attribute selectors match the attribute or value for a given element. Can you recall what attribute and value mean? A quick recap. Let's say you have a HTML image tag. IMG is the name of the tag, while src and alt are the names of its attributes. The actual name of the image file, first.jpg, is the value. Now let's explore an example of how attribute selectors can be used. Say you have a HTML file with 3 A tags, each with a href attribute that points to a different page on the Meta website. The first one has no class, whereas the second one has a class called Home and the third a class called About. With different variations of the attribute selectors, you can target different attributes of the HTML. For instance, you can style all elements that have a defined class by adding class inside the square brackets. In this case, it will turn the second and third link green. Alternatively, you can target all 3 elements by inserting the href attribute, a star, and a common value that is part of all the links that you want to target. In this case, it can be the text meta. Now all 3 links will be green because each link contains the word meta. Or you can target only the first element by adding the specific link as the value of the href attribute that you want to target inside the square brackets. Wherever there is an attribute on a web page, you can use some variation of an attribute selector to modify it. This makes attribute selectors a very flexible styling tool. But let's move on to 2 other widely used selectors that you need to know about. nth of type and nth child selectors. The syntax of these two selectors is very similar. As their names suggest, these selectors target the nth child or nth type of a specified parent element. But what does parent mean exactly? Well, say you have a few list elements in an unordered list element. The unordered list element is the parent tag in this case, and the 3 list elements are the children. Now let's specify that the second list element must have a certain styling. In this case, you can use both the nth of type and the nth child selectors to do that. Both will produce the same output, where the second list element will be colored aqua in this case. Another commonly used selector is the star selector. Just like in many other programming languages, star selectors are used for selecting all the elements of a web page. It will affect all the elements in the HTML file. It is especially helpful when you want to reset the default settings and styles that browsers use before they apply your styling to the web page. Finally, did you know that you can group selectors? If you want to apply the same styling to more than one type of element, like the heading 1 and paragraph elements, you can use group selectors. Instead of using element selectors, where you use a rule for every element, such as heading 1 and P, you can type H1, P and then add the CSS properties. The CSS rule will then be applied to all heading 1 and paragraph elements. Group selectors can save you a lot of time. They are also called selector stacking. In this video, you reviewed the CSS selectors that you are familiar with. You also learned about additional widely used CSS selectors, their syntax, and how they can be used to target specific elements on your web pages. The selectors covered were attribute selectors, nth of type and nth child selectors, star selectors, and group selectors. Learning how to use these CSS selectors is important because it allows you to be more specific when styling your web pages. In the rest of this lesson, you will be introduced to several advanced selectors. At first, they might seem more complex than the ones covered in this video, but with a bit of practice, they will become part of your everyday web styling toolkit. Sometimes you want to apply the same styling to different elements or to different groups of elements. CSS makes it possible to combine more than one selector so that you can apply rules to elements based on their relationship with one another. You do this with combination selectors, and there are 4 main types, namely descendant selectors, child selectors, general sibling selectors, and adjacent sibling selectors. In this video, you will learn about combination selectors and how you can use them to target more specific elements. Let's start with descendant selectors. Descendant selectors are useful if you need to select HTML elements that are contained within another selector. The easiest way to remember descendant selectors is to think of a family. You pick a person in the family and then select all descendants such as children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who have, say, brown hair. For example, you can have a HTML file with a div tag and its ID attribute set to blog. Inside the div tag are a few heading tags. In this example, all H1 elements are descendants of the element with the ID blog. So to make all the H1 descendants blue, you can add the ID selector #blog followed by the H1 selector with a space in between and then the properties in curly brackets. Child selectors, on the other hand, are more specific than descendant selectors. To go back to the family example, with child selectors, you select a person and then select only their immediate children who have red hair. Let's update the previous selector to a child selector by adding a closed angle bracket in between the 2 selectors. The effect is that now only the first H1 element turns blue. This is because it is the only H1 element that is a child of the element with the blog ID attribute. Next, let's focus on general sibling selectors, which apply rules to all the selectors of the same type that follow the first type. To use the family analogy again, general sibling selectors allow you to select a person and then select all younger brothers with black hair. You can update the selector with a tilde in between the 2 selectors to make it a general sibling selector. The selector now targets all paragraph elements that are siblings of a H1 element. The result is the last 2 paragraph elements turn blue. Notice that the first paragraph element didn't turn blue. This is because the general sibling selector only selects subsequent elements that match the selector. In comparison to sibling selectors, you can use adjacent sibling selectors to target only the first or adjacent element that follows another element. Once again, if you think about a family, this selector selects a person and then selects the next younger brothers. Finally, let's replace the tilde with a plus sign to update this selector to an adjacent sibling selector. The selector now selects all paragraph elements that are adjacent siblings of the H1 element. The result is that only the middle paragraph element turns blue. This is because the adjacent sibling selector only selects the first subsequent element if it matches the selector. Now that you are more familiar with combination selectors, let's explore a few practical examples. I will now demonstrate two combination selectors, the general sibling selector and the adjacent sibling selector. Let's start with the general sibling selector. Remember, the general sibling selectors select all the matching elements of the second type which follow the first type. The HTML file has a paragraph tag with the words basic info about Little Lemon, and that is followed by a div tag with the word about. After the div tag, there is an unordered list with 3 list items. This structure repeats below. So there is another paragraph tag, a div tag, and then an unordered list with 2 list items. Now let's inspect the CSS rules. First, I set basic rules for the HTML body. This is so that the special effect that I will apply with the sibling selector will stand out. Below the styling for the body is the general sibling selector. I set the div tag as the parent and the unordered list as the sibling. Remember, for the sibling selector, you always use a tilde. This time, I specify a contrasting background color, white. Then notice that I added the box shadow effect. As the name indicates, it adds a box with a shadow around the element that you target. The box shadow property consists of the horizontal offset set to 1 pixel, the vertical offset set to 1 pixel, and then the blur radius, which I set to 3 pixels. Thereafter, you need to specify the color of the shadow, which in this case is set to grey. So what elements will be styled? Remember, sibling selectors apply rules to all the selectors of the same type that follow the first type. Let's go to the HTML again to identify what will be styled. The first div tag is the reference, so the rules will target the unordered list that follows it. And again, the second div tag will also serve as a reference, and the rules will affect the unordered list that follows it. Let's inspect the output. The background is orange and there are 2 box shadows, each with an unordered list inside it. Notice that the subheadings that are inside div tags about and employee or owner just have the body styling. The sibling selector only targets the items that follow the div tags. By now, you should realize that you can use the sibling selector to efficiently apply the same styling to several elements with one rule. If there is another instance where an unordered list follows a div tag on this page, it will also have a box shadow. But say the page has other unordered lists that do not follow a div tag, the styling will not be applied to those elements. Next, I will demonstrate how to use the adjacent selector. The HTML file contains an image tag and then 3 paragraph tags. Thereafter, there is another image tag followed by a div tag and then a paragraph tag. Lastly, there is another image tag followed by a paragraph tag. Notice that the first paragraph after the top and bottom images are descriptions of the images above it. So I want to style these paragraphs so that it looks like captions. In other words, I want to style all paragraphs that follow an image, but not affect any other paragraphs or other elements like a div tag. And I can do this with the adjacent selector. Because remember, the difference between an adjacent selector and a sibling selector is that the adjacent selector only targets the first element following the reference element, whereas the sibling selector targets all the elements of the same type after the reference element. Let's inspect the output and CSS code. As explained, the first paragraph that follows the image is styled differently than the next 2 paragraphs. Notice that I set up the styling in the adjacent rule so that it will appear as a caption. The text is smaller and aligned in the center. Again, with one rule, I applied styling to 2 captions. If you have a site with many images and captions, the adjacent selector will be very helpful and save you a lot of time. In this video, you learned about combination selectors and how to use them. As you become more advanced in styling your web pages, these CSS selectors will surely be helpful in targeting specific items and save you a lot of time. Pseudo-class selectors give developers great control over what they select and style. By knowing how to use these selectors, you will not only improve the interactivity of your web pages, but you will also be able to add advanced styling without too much effort. These selectors are also often referred to as just pseudo-classes. Previously, you were briefly introduced to the pseudo-class invalid. Remember, pseudo-classes are state-based selectors, which means that they allow you to select elements based on their state, for example, the hover state. You use pseudo-class selectors to improve the interactivity of web pages by styling elements in response to user input. In this video, you will explore practical examples of how to do this. There are many types of pseudo-classes. Other than the hover state, examples include selecting an element when it is active or in focus, or when a link has already been visited. Pseudo-classes are also very effective to target specific elements such as, let's say, the fifth item in a list, bold items, empty elements, and so on. Let's review the general syntax that you use for various pseudo-classes. You add the selector, a colon, the pseudo-class, and then the properties. While there isn't a broadly accepted classification for pseudo-classes, you can group them in terms of general similarities and their purpose. Let's explore a few of these general classifications. The first group you need to know about is user action states, which include the hover pseudo-class, which changes the style of an element when a cursor hovers over it. The active pseudo-class, which styles an element only while a user actively presses and holds the mouse button. And the focus pseudo-class, which focuses styling on the element that you use it for. These pseudo-classes have an effect while a user is actively engaging with a HTML element. Let's explore an example of how the hover and active pseudo-classes can be used. Say you have a HTML file with an A tag inside a paragraph and a button element inside a div element. The paragraph element has a class defined as myPage, and the button class is defined as myButton. Now let's explore the CSS. First, it contains basic styling for the myPage and myButton class elements. Then, to make the link change its appearance when a user hovers over it, you use the hover pseudo-class to target a tag. To change the myButton class, you use the active pseudo-class. The active pseudo-class changes the properties of an element when the state of that element is active. In this case, the styling properties will be applied only when a user presses and holds the mouse button. In this example, the pseudo-class selectors target HTML elements, but you can also use them to target HTML class attributes. Next, let's focus on form states. Previously, when discussing form validation, you were introduced to the invalid pseudo-class selector. But there are more pseudo-classes that are specifically used for HTML forms. They usually come in pairs and target the different states that elements can have. Form state pseudo-classes include disabled and enabled, generally used for buttons, checked and indeterminate, that are used for checkboxes, and valid and invalid, used in case of fields like emails and phone numbers. Another pseudo-class type that you should know about is specific position-based states. They allow you to target specific items, for instance, a specific list item among the list elements. Some examples of this type include first of type, last of type, nth of type, and nth last of type. Let's explore an example of first of type. Say you have two list items in a HTML page, Adrian and Mario. With the first of type pseudo-class, you can style the first item of its type while the remaining items will not be affected. In this video, you explored a few examples of how you can use pseudo-classes to improve the interactivity of your web pages. There are plenty of other pseudo-classes, and some of them are more popular than others. You're encouraged to follow your own style and explore the creative possibilities that pseudo-classes offer. By now, you should know that developers use pseudo-classes to style and make web pages more interactive. In this video, you will explore pseudo-classes that you can use to style links on web pages, namely web link states. Although you can use web link states for many functionalities, developers often use them to style the color of links that a user already opened. For instance, a HTML file can have two A tags, each with its own href that links to a different page of a website. To give the links their initial color, you can use the link pseudo-class selector. And to let the links change color once a user has visited these pages, you can use the visited pseudo-class selector. But if you're using multiple pseudo-classes for a specific element, there is an important rule to keep in mind. The order in which you apply pseudo-classes in a document determines which style will be displayed, so be careful not to accidentally overwrite a style you want to set. Developers use the acronym LVHA to remind them of the order that they need to follow when writing pseudo-class rules. LVHA stands for Link, Visited, Hover, Active. so always apply pseudo-class styles in the correct order. First link, then visited, next hover, and lastly active. Now that you know more about web link states, let's explore how to use the link, visited, hover, and active pseudo-classes. Additionally, you will learn 2 more effects that you can create with the hover pseudo-class. In the pseudo-links.html file, I added 3 tags, a heading tag followed by a paragraph tag and another paragraph tag. In the heading tag, I added the name of the restaurant, Little Lemon, and the first paragraph tag has a link to their Instagram page. Now I go to my CSS code by clicking on the pseudo-links.css file at the top of my screen. In this file, I already added properties related to the pseudo classes we discussed previously, namely link, visited, hover, and active. To display the output of this code, I move back to my HTML file and click the view icon at the top right of my screen. By default, the link to the Little Lemon Instagram page displays in a blue color because I set it to blue with the link pseudo class in the CSS code. As expected, when I move the mouse over the link, the color changes to green because I added green as the value of the color attribute in the hover pseudo class. Let's test what happens when I click and hold the link. It changes to white text on a black background, just like defined with the active pseudo-class property. When I click on the link to visit the Little Lemon Instagram page, the system asks me to connect to an external source since I am using Visual Studio Code. I click the cancel option for now, but after I visit the link, the color of the link will change to violet because I defined it to do that with the visited pseudo-class. I'm now going to demonstrate how you can use the pseudo-class hover. To do this, I use the pseudo-shadow.html file I created previously. In this file, I added 4 paragraph tags, each belonging to a class called textual. I also added random text, commonly used in publishing and graphic design, as placeholder text. The CSS code that I added is fairly simple. The first property defines the properties of the textual class. The second property defines the effect that the pseudo-class hover will have on the textual class. For the hover pseudo-class, I use the shorthand for a box shadow property. As you've seen earlier, box shadow adds 1 or more shadows to an element. The horizontal offset is set to 5 pixels. The vertical offset is set to 0 pixels. The blur radius is set to 25 pixels, and the color of the shadow is set to black. I move back to my HTML file to output this code and click on the view icon. The Little Lemon page with blocks of text displays. The text looks like regular blocks of text, but when I hover over a block of code with my mouse, it gets highlighted with a box shadow around the edges. I get the same effect when I hover over any other block of text, as all the blocks of text belong to the same textual class. This is an interesting effect that is simple to create with the help of the hover pseudo-class. In this video, you learned how to use pseudo-classes like web link states to improve the interactivity of web pages. You also explored additional effects that you can create with the hover effect. Most popular websites have numerous animation effects. You might be so used to effects that you fail to notice them while using the web. Think of sliding galleries, hover over, or cursor effects. Applying effects to web pages is an essential skill for any front-end developer. In this video, you will learn what effects are and briefly explore common effects being used currently. So, what exactly is an effect? The formal definition of the word effect is a change that is a result or consequence of an action or other cause. Animations are a type of effect that has brought lifelike quality to web pages, and today they are an all-pervasive part of web development. In other words, animations are graphics in motion transitioning over time. The idea of animation had been around for many years before technology was good enough to integrate it into online experiences. The graphics interchange form, or GIFs, can arguably be labeled as the first attempt to bring effects to web pages. The first GIF ever created was of a moving airplane by Steve Wilhite in 1987. GIFs were followed by Flash animations. Flash made it possible to add audio and video components, as well as create dynamic websites. But Flash needed a special browser plugin to work, and that was a major limitation. When CSS came into use, it provided a simple, easy-to-learn solution that also made it possible to manipulate formats such as scalable vector graphics, or SVGs. There are plenty of programs and libraries that front-end developers can use to add animation to websites today. Libraries such as jQuery and PopMotion add fantastic visuals to sites. The downside is that they are hard to learn and can increase the development time of websites considerably. CSS, on the other hand, is still popular for adding effects to websites because it is easy to learn and simplifies web development. When it comes to basic animations and effects in general, CSS still offers more value in relation to time and resources. With some practice, CSS can produce surprisingly good effects. The possibilities for creating effects with CSS are endless, yet some effects are more popular than others. You will now discover a few that you can effectively create with CSS. The hover effect, which you learned about in the previous lesson, is possibly one of the most frequently used effects on web pages today. Developers use it to show that an element is matched by highlighting it in some way when the mouse hovers over it. Examples include the lightening or darkening of an element, or even other effects that highlight the placement of the cursor. Another popular effect is changing the appearance of the cursor. Instead of the conventional arrows, you can add animated effects that change the color or gradient, and so on. You are surely familiar with sliding galleries and slideshows. They are commonly used to display collections of images or text boxes. And then you get video backgrounds, which are commonly added to the top of the screen to illustrate movement. An effect that gained popularity since its introduction is the parallax effect. It gives users the perception of depth and dimension with foreground elements moving faster than the background elements. It is likely that you are familiar with the back to the top effect. It is a simple element like a button that enables quickly scrolling all the way to the top of the page from the current button placement. Developers commonly use element and color transitions to emphasize focus on objects as users scroll through web pages. Full screen snapping is a quick transition from one page to another that occurs automatically while users are scrolling. Now that you are familiar with some popular effects, let's briefly visit the pros and cons of adding effects on web pages. The primary driving factor of web pages these days is to attract the attention of users. Web pages that use animation and effects optimally keep the attention of users without overwhelming them. Effects help highlight the special features on a given page. CSS styling and effects improve the creativity and aesthetics of websites, but too much of it can also lead to distraction and drive users away from the page. Besides, more animations increase the size of your CSS files, which can cause your web page to load slowly in areas with low bandwidth. Nonetheless, effects improve online experiences in general and are especially used to create intuitive navigation. You should now understand what effects and animations are. You also got a quick overview of the history of effects and the most popular effects used on the web today. Lastly, you explore the benefits and disadvantages of adding effects to websites. Websites without effects are not only dull, but users also have a hard time finding their way around such sites. Mastering CSS effects will enable you to create web pages that users love to use.
Have you ever opened a website with a lot of text and thought, wow? There are two very different reasons you might have that reaction. Text or words can make a website engaging and interesting, but they can also make it look dull and cause users to lose attention. With the help of CSS, you can make the most of text by adding interesting effects. First, I will explain how to use the text overflow property that determines how overflowing content is displayed on your website. The first example sets the text overflow property with the value ellipsis. Let's take note of two CSS properties for the text class, whitespace and text overflow. The whitespace CSS property controls how whitespace inside an element is handled. The whitespace property in this code has a value of no wrap. The text overflow property specifies what to do with the content if it overflows its container. It has several possible values such as hidden to hide the content, or scroll to add a scroll bar. It is important to note that the text overflow property here is set to ellipsis. An ellipsis is 3 dots that represent the text that is clipped. So if I hover over the overflowing text which is present inside, the hidden text is displayed. As soon as I move the cursor away from the block, the text is again substituted by the ellipsis. This is very similar to the second example, which sets the value of text overflow to clip. In this example, the additional content is truncated to fit within the limits of the box. so if I hover over it with the cursor, the clipped text is displayed. In the third example, I demonstrate how to create vertical text. In the output, the words 12 to 15 items are placed vertically within the otherwise horizontal text. I do this by putting those words inside a separate p tag with class name vert. Then in the CSS code, I set the writing mode property to be vertical RL. The next example demonstrates the word wrap property. Word wrap determines how the words in a paragraph break up and wrap onto the next line. This property has different values such as break word, normal, initial, and a few others. In this example, I use the value break word. As a result, the words illustration and property are both broken up across multiple lines. In the next two examples, I will add text effects using simple CSS code. In this example, I use a property called text shadow, which has a shorthand with 4 values. The first value is the x-coordinate, which represents the horizontal shadow. The second is the y-coordinate, which represents the vertical shadow. The third is the blur radius, and the fourth is the shadow color. This next example explores an extension of the same idea. My HTML code has 2 heading tags, each with the class name glow. In the corresponding CSS code, I've added the text shadow effects for that class. I can use the output to determine whether I need to adjust the color effects until I'm happy with it. That's all my examples. In this video, you learned how to add effects to your text using a few simple rules in CSS.
So far, you've learned how animation can be used to add interactivity and responsiveness to a web page. Eventually, you'll be able to create amazing animations with CSS. But to get started, this video will introduce you to 2 properties with which you can create basic animations. In this video, you will learn how to use the transform and transition properties. The syntax of the transform and transition properties are similar. You simply add transform or transition and the value. But what exactly do these properties do? The transform property modifies the spatial position of an element. For instance, it can change its scale and angle. But these changes are not very effective or user-friendly because they are instantaneous. To really create the illusion of motion, you need to control the speed of this effect. To do this, developers use the transition property in conjunction with the transform property. Let's explore how these 2 properties work together. For example, you can set up your H1 elements to rotate 0 degrees by default, but by using the hover pseudo class and the transform property, you can let the element rotate to 20 degrees when the mouse hovers over it. Without a transition, the rotation will be instant. But by adding the transition property with the value transform 2s, the rotation will animate over 2 seconds. Now that you know the basics about the transform and transition properties, let's explore a practical example. I already set up a HTML file that contains a div tag with the class container and in it 2 other div tags. The first div tag contains the letter A with a class called A. The second contains the letter B with a class called B. Let's view the CSS file. It has 2 class selectors, .a and .b, and each has a margin property. This is just to add a space in between the div elements. First, I add the transform property to the A class. There are a number of keyword and function values inside this property. I choose skew X from the suggestion list that appears. This will tilt the letter on its x-axis. You can also choose to skew it on its y-axis or even on both axes. I add a value of 20 degrees. Next, I add a transform property to the B class as well, but this time I use the keyword rotate and add the value of 20 degrees. This will cause a different effect. Let's inspect the output. A displays skew, almost like an italic letter, but towards the other way. B, on the other hand, looks normal, but it is turned sideways by 20 degrees. Since these transform effects are instantaneous, you do not notice them as they are applied. To change this, you need to add the transition property. I add the transition property to both classes with the value of 5 seconds. This time you can notice how the letters transform because it happens slower. Let's move on to a more complex example. I open another HTML file with a class called box inside a div tag element. First, I will write the rules for the box. Then I will add rules using a hover pseudo class and grouping selectors to perform transformations on the box. The initial output will be a green box. Let's go to the CSS file and write the rules for the box. The first property I add for the box is display as grid. Then I set the width and height to 240 pixels and also add a margin of 100 pixels so that the box will display in the center of the output screen. Next, I add a background color with an RGB value. Then I specify the border properties. I add the border radius and give it a value of 12 pixels. Using shorthand notation, I specify the border to be solid and add an RGB value in hex format. Finally, I set the border width to 4 pixels. These properties basically define the width, style, and color of the border. So far, the output is a light green box with a darker green border. Now let's move back to the CSS to add some effects. I add a class selector for the box and then add the hover pseudo class. This is so that the transform effect that I will add next will only happen when I hover over the box. Let's add the transform property. This time I add rotate around the Z-axis. The Z-axis is perpendicular to the screen. So when I hover over the box, it will rotate from my point of view. I add rotate Z at an angle of 60 degrees. Let's inspect the output. When I hover over the box, it rotates 60 degrees. Let's add a few more effects. I add a light coral background color to the hover pseudo class. When I hover over the box now, it also changes the background color. Let's also change the opacity to 50%. Now when I hover over the box, it changes the opacity of the box too. All these effects are fine, but they happen too fast. Just like in the first example of the letters, I need to add the transition property if I want to slow down the transform effect. I add the value of 2 seconds. When I hover over the box this time, the change happens gradually over a span of 2 seconds. Well done! You now know how to use the transform and transition properties. In this video, you learned how to create a basic animation using the transform and transition properties in conjunction. A number of different effects like these can be performed with the help of the two properties, transform and transition, and combining them with pseudo classes such as hover, active, and others. By now you should know the basics of CSS animation. It's time to explore some more advanced properties and rules. In this video, you will learn how to use the animation property in combination with the @keyframes rule to create advanced animations. When developers want to create complex animations, they use the animation property, but to control the execution of the steps of the animation, they use the @keyframe rule. Next, let's explore the syntax of the @keyframe rule and the animation property. The @keyframe rule specifies the name of the animation and the individual keyframes for the animation. You define each keyframe with a keyframe selector and CSS styles for that keyframe. The @keyframe rule can also use the optional keywords from and to show transitions. The animation name links the animation to a specific keyframe rule. The animation property has a number of sub-properties like animation name, animation delay, and so on. You can use a shorthand CSS syntax to set all the sub-properties of the animation property. But say you want one or more of them to have the default settings, you simply leave them out. However, each of the sub-properties can be listed individually as well. To understand animation cues, let's explore a simple animation of a clock with hour and minute hands. The HTML code for the clock will consist of only 3 basic elements, which are the div class called clock, and inside it a div class called minutes and another div class called hours. Take note how both hours and minutes have an additional common class called hand. In order to let the clock work, you need this additional hand class with its own CSS rules. But since the focus of this lesson is to understand the animation part of the CSS, the basic styling properties of the clock are not covered now. All that you need to know is that you create 2 classes, clock and hand, and insert style rules that specify the basic layout and appearance of the clock and hands. So far, the output of the CSS is a static blue clock face and red hands with white borders. Now you can configure the animation for both the hour and minutes classes. The only difference between the two will be the speed at which they change positions. For the minutes class, you add the animation property with the value of 6 seconds infinite linear. For the hours class, you add the animation property with the value of cycle 60 seconds infinite linear. These two rules set the animation name cycle to complete iterations for respective timings over an infinite time duration and linear timing function. Since the other animation properties are not mentioned, they are set to the default values. Finally, you can add the @keyframe rule. Type @keyframe cycle and then the two special keywords, namely from and to. For the from keyword, add the transform property with the value of rotate 0 degrees. And for the to keyword, add the transform property with the value of rotate 360 degrees. Since keyframes is a type of rule in CSS, we will be adding these details inside curly braces. There will be a follow-up reading about keyframes after this video. So what exactly does this CSS animation do? Well, it uses the transform property to rotate the cycle associated with both the hours and minute classes from the value of 0 to 360 degrees. The combination of properties and rules will give a seamless appearance of a clock in continuous motion. In this video, you've learned how to use the animation property and the @keyframe rule together to get a specific effect. CSS offers endless creativity when it comes to animation. The properties and rules you covered can be configured in many more ways. For instance, you can combine them with other elements like images to achieve amazing animations using purely CSS.
By now you should know that CSS offers many possibilities for creating interesting animations. But to make your animations more complex and exciting, you need to have good control over the timing. That's why you need to know how to work with keyframes. In this video, you will learn how to do a basic keyframe animation in CSS. Previously, you learned how to animate a bouncing ball using the HTML canvas element and JavaScript. This time, you'll learn how to create the same animation using CSS. I opened Visual Studio Code and created my basic HTML structure in a file named index.html. In the head element, I added a link element to reference a CSS file named styles.css. First, I'll add the HTML element that will be animated. In this case, the element will represent the bouncing ball. So I add a div element to the body element and set its ID attribute to ball. Now I open styles.css. First, I add the keyframes definition. I'll name this animation bounce. Next, I add the from keyword with open and close curly brackets to define the starting state of the animation. The starting position should be the default position of the element. So I add the transform property and set its value to translate 3D with the coordinates 0, 0, 0. These three values are the coordinates along the x, y, and z axis in 3D space. Next, I add the to keyword with open and close curly brackets to define the ending state of the animation. The ending position should be 640 pixels right of the starting position. To do this, I add the transform property and set its value to transform 3D with the coordinates 640 pixels, 0, 0. This means that the element is translated by 640 pixels on the x-axis and 0 pixels on the y and z axis. Finally, I add a CSS rule for the ball. I use the ID selector to select the ball element. First, I need to add a set of properties to make the element render as a ball. To do this, I set the width and height properties to 80 pixels. Then I set the border radius to 50%. This will round the corners of the element so much that it will appear like a circle. Finally, I set the background color property to hashtag 62687F to fill in the color of the circle. I save the file and open index.html in live preview. Great, the ball is rendering correctly. Now to connect the animation to the element. I open styles.css again. In the CSS rule for the ball element, I add the animation property and set its value to bounce 2s. This will play the bounce animation over a 2-second duration. I then add the animation direction property and set its value to alternate. This will play the animation in reverse when it completes. And then finally, I add the animation iteration count property and set its value to infinite. This will play the animation loop infinitely. I save the file and open index.html again in live preview. The animation plays, but the speed of the movement is not consistent. The ball moves slowly at the start, then speeds up in the middle and slows down again at the end of the animation. This is because the default timing function is the ease function that animates with this behavior. There are many timing functions available, such as ease, linear, ease in, and ease out. You can read more about this in the additional resources. To match the animation that I built in HTML and JavaScript, I set the animation timing function to linear. I open styles.css again. In the CSS rule for the ball element, I update the animation property and set its value to bounce 2s linear. This will play the bounce animation over a 2-second duration using the linear function. I save the file and open index.html again in live preview. Now my animation plays exactly as I intended it to do. In this video, you learned how to create a simple keyframe animation with CSS. But CSS animations and keyframes are quite powerful. Try challenging yourself and see what animations you can build.
Have you ever made a mistake while programming? Well, you're not alone. After all, mistakes are a part of programming. If there are never any errors in your code, that means you're either extremely skilled or not writing enough code. While there will always be errors in your code, some can be avoided. This ability to avoid errors is especially true for the mistakes that beginner coders typically make. In the next couple of minutes, you will learn about the common errors that are made in programming and about the good practices you can implement to avoid making these errors. The common errors that developers make can broadly be classified as skill-based, rule-based, and knowledge-based. Many skill-based errors can be classified as typos. That is to say, they are mistakes made when typing in the code. These typos can include omitting delimiters at the end of the syntax, or some quotation marks while defining values, and forgetting to close brackets. For example, say there's some code where the programmer didn't enter the closing bracket. When the closing bracket is typed, the code becomes functional again. This can also be extended to syntax errors, such as closing the tags in HTML. Sometimes it can be as basic as not having a proper doc-type declaration in your HTML code. All of these are simple mistakes and typos that happen while writing your code, but these are also the ones that take the most time to correct. While a lot of these syntax errors are flagged with the help of modern IDEs such as Visual Code, clean code is still the responsibility of the developer. For example, there are also some things such as using inline tags and writing tags in the uppercase which won't be flagged or stop the code execution but are still considered bad practice. Next, let's explore rule-based errors in more detail. These are code-based mistakes developers make when they do not follow the rules. For instance, did you know that you cannot start a class name with a numeric value? Naming mistakes are typical rule-based errors. While this may not be obvious for someone new to CSS, there are many specific rules set for different elements in CSS that you may come across. There are also so many properties that can be used for a given CSS selector that it can be confusing. This confusion can lead to errors. For example, here is a short list of just some of the different properties that can accept color values and be intermixed. Color, background color, font color, and border color. Or there is often more than one way in which the same page can be designed, such as flexbox, grids, and so on, each with its own set of properties. All these properties may add to the confusion if not dealt with correctly. There are also knowledge-based errors. These errors happen when you are a more experienced coder, but you still have gaps in your knowledge. There is a tendency to have more and more complicated code, using complex queries such as using attribute selectors or writing rules for multiple classes. Expanding your coding knowledge will make coding easier, but at the same time, it may make things confusing if you make your code too complex. For example, when you have to go back to code after not seeing it for a while, and you have to figure out what you were doing when you initially wrote it. And that's why you should be aware of best practices in CSS when it comes to error prevention and correction. Let's examine the best practices you can follow. One of the best practices you can apply to avoid common errors is using shorthand. A code with 4 properties can be written using 1 property instead, like in this example. Writing it with shorthand makes reading the code easier. Learning shorthand takes practice, but it can save time and effort if you know how to use it. Another best practice is applying specificity. Understanding specificity while writing code can also help you to avoid errors, just like you learned in an earlier reading. Let's take this example. Both rules are targeting the same anchor tag of HTML, and the specificity will be calculated by the browser to determine which rule to apply first. In this case, it will be the first rule that will be applied. Understanding specificity while writing code can help you to avoid misconfigurations. Over-specificity can lead to increased loading time for browsers because they need to apply specific rules. A good practice in programming is to apply the rules as broadly as possible. For example, where possible, apply it over a container instead of to the content inside it. While the errors and practices mentioned are by no means exhaustive, the best way to learn is by designing more web pages and integrating good practices into your code as you go. You must take care to avoid over-specificity. For instance, where the inside of the layout has a division tag containing a class with an anchor tag to which you may apply rules. This is over-specifying the target element of rule. Instead, this should be replaced with a class or ID selector. Over-specificity leads to wasting time. You waste the browser's time in applying over-specifics in the present, but it can also lead to you wasting your time troubleshooting later. You should also avoid the redundancy of rules, selectors, and properties to prevent confusion. When using different selectors, you can end up applying rules more than once to target the same element. Another good practice is performing a CSS reset using a universal selector before you begin writing your code. Every browser has different settings that may cause problems with the formatting that you've defined. By removing browser-specific configurations using the universal or star selector, you can avoid the chances of misconfigured layouts appearing on web pages and save a lot of effort later. By continually designing pages, you will develop your skills, and as a result, you will progressively make fewer errors. You learned about the common errors made in HTML and CSS, as well as good practices to avoid them. Great work!
In this video, you're going to learn about how you can handle errors in CSS. The first thing that you should know is that CSS does not handle errors in the same way that most programming languages do. The code does not break or stop executing. Instead, it just passes through the code and simply ignores the lines that it does not understand. In fact, it can also ignore the next property after the mistake that is inside the same selector. In VS Code, I opened the HTML and CSS files that we used to demonstrate the transform and transition properties in an earlier video. Let me open the output to remind you what the CSS styling does. Now I'm going to tweak the CSS code to create a mistake. Let's remove a semicolon after the background color properties of the boxes. Visual Studio Code provides some basic information about mistakes. To get that information, I click on View and then Problems. An error message displays in the problem panel that says missed semicolon. But this error does not prevent the execution of the rest of the code. When I run the code, the boxes still display, but only their borders are visible and they have square corners. In other words, the CSS before the error is executed, giving the boxes their size and placing them in a grid, still run. Then the background color properties, as well as the border radius properties in the line below, are skipped. After that, the rest of the styling is still applied, such as the border properties as well as the hover pseudoclass properties. Let's put back the semicolon and create another error. When I remove the semicolon after the background color properties of the hover class, the hover effect still works, but the color does not change to light coral. The opacity properties in the next line are also not executed, but the transition property still works. Now I put back the semicolon to correct the code. But sometimes you need to validate the code for more than just syntax errors, such as checking against specific coding conventions and best practices. To resolve these kinds of issues, developers use a tool called a linter. A linter is a tool that applies a set of rules to check the syntax and find any problematic patterns or inefficiencies in the code. There are a number of linter tools and websites available. Alternatively, you can also install a third-party tool using the command line or extensions in VS Code. You can find more about these online tools and how to install linter extensions in the additional resources at the end of the lesson. Next, I will demonstrate how to lint your CSS code using a Visual Studio Code extension called StyleLint. There are plenty of StyleLint rules that you can use. For this demonstration, I am using the alpha value notation rule and the color no hex rule. The alpha value notation rule requires using a specific notation for alpha values, whereas the color no hex rule disallows the usage of hex color notation. These are just examples and are not necessarily best practices. You can select your own set of lint rules according to your own best practices. Now that the StyleLint extension is running, other errors are showing in the Problems panel. The alpha value notation lint rule states that 50% should be written as 0.5. Notice that it also indicates on which line and at which character I can find the issue. In line 14, the value of the opacity property is set to 50%. I change it to 0.5 and now the error notification disappears. The color no hex lint rule states that an unexpected hex color was found on line 8. To update the hex code to a valid notation such as HSL, I can click on the color box in the CSS code. A color panel pops up. I toggle between the different color notations by clicking at the top of the color panel until it is set to HSL. StyleLint is just one example of the many developer tools in Visual Studio Code that you can use to find lint errors. Many browsers also have testing tools, such as the Inspect or Compute tools, that allow you to modify your CSS code and verify the changes directly in the browser.
Have you ever had a broken power outlet in your home? Or maybe a light switch stopped working? When that happens, you usually call an electrician to come fix the problem. And when they arrive, they have many tools with them to test the wiring in your home to figure out the cause of the problem. As a developer, if your web page isn't displaying correctly, you also need tools to help inspect and diagnose the cause of the problem. This is why the developer tools in your web browser are so useful. Every web browser comes with a set of tools to assist in the development of web pages and web applications. There are different diagnostic functions that the developer tools provide. These include viewing error logs, debugging JavaScript code, inspecting HTTP requests and responses, inspecting performance and memory usage of JavaScript code, inspecting CSS grids and flexbox layouts, inspecting HTML and CSS rendering, and live editing. Inspecting HTML and CSS rendering will probably help you the most while building your web page. And for that reason, it'll be the main focus of this video, although we will return to live editing closer to the end of the video. Right-clicking in your browser and clicking Inspect opens the developer tools. This means you have your page and its HTML document side by side on screen at the same time. This allows you to highlight a certain displayed element on the rendered page, like the logo, and note its corresponding HTML highlighted in the developer tools. Think of all the time it'll save you when you're trying to locate the code of a troublesome element. Also, when you have the element on the web page highlighted, you can inspect the CSS rules applied to it in the developer tools. That makes finding problems easier because you can identify which CSS rules are being applied to an element and what the properties of those rules are. Next, let's move on to the box model, a CSS and HTML feature that you can inspect using developer tools. Depending on your web browser, it will display beside the CSS rules or in a dedicated tab called Computed, which is located beside the Styles tab. You can use the box model to identify the outcome of the CSS rules applied to an element. This will help pinpoint if a CSS rule is incorrectly applied or has an incorrect property value. No matter what kind of problem you have in your code, you have to systematically use the diagnostic developer tools to figure out what's going on. But what about combining different developer tools? While being able to inspect HTML and CSS rendering is undeniably useful, it can be more powerful when used together with live editing your HTML and CSS. With live editing, you can update HTML and CSS code inside of the developer tools. This allows you to test CSS rule changes and adjust HTML elements to verify fixes before permanently adding them into your code. And saves a lot of time because you spend less time editing and reloading your web pages. Isn't that great? In this video, you explored how using browser developer tools can assist with debugging HTML and CSS code. Just like the electrician, you as a developer have many tools at your disposal to inspect and diagnose problems. And developer tools definitely make creating and maintaining web pages and web applications easier. The next reading will explore developer tools in more detail. One of the frustrations you're likely to run into will be compatibility issues that occur when rendering your CSS files on different browsers. Well, you can use code and specialized websites to sort out these compatibility issues. In the next couple of minutes, you will learn about the interactivity of CSS with other browsers and how you can add code to your CSS files to ensure compatibility with these browsers. You will also learn about the specialized websites available that you can use to check whether your code is valid on multiple browsers. CSS has been around for a long time and has evolved quite significantly since it was first introduced. As new features are added to the CSS specification, compatibility issues can occur while the different browsers decide on the implementation of the new features. While all the major browsers are mostly in alignment on how CSS is implemented, there are still browser-specific differences that occur, which sometimes may disturb the layout, styling, and other responsive components related to CSS. Additionally, each browser has its own default CSS properties for different HTML elements. Most browsers have their own specific engines that are used for rendering HTML and CSS. Examples of these include Safari's Engine WebKit, Google Chrome, and other Chromium-based browsers like Edge and Opera's Blink. As a result, different browsers can have different ways in which the CSS rules get displayed, even if the styling and alignment are defined correctly. The changes that occur are usually subtle. For example, colors and fonts may appear slightly different from the original styling, and this may affect the user's experience. However, sometimes the difference can be more noticeable, like with layouts, specifically involving alignment. Let's explore one such example now involving the use of flex and grid layouts. The most common layouts that render differently depending on the browser in use are the flex and grid layouts. For example, animated grids sometimes don't animate correctly in certain browsers, and Flexbox can have trouble handling the correct aspect ratios and alignment. To help identify and solve these issues, there are many websites available to you to check browser-specific CSS compatibility. For example, developers can use one of these sites to check if the border radius rule in the CSS rule is compatible with all the different browsers. There are also websites that provide a virtual environment where you can select specific browsers and their versions. In these virtual environments, you can insert your code in the browser or run a website that you've built that is already live to see how it works. It's also important to check the compatibility and rendering of websites on mobile devices that typically have different configurations than a website on a desktop. Okay, so you now know that browser compatibility issues can occur in CSS. Let's examine an example of browser-specific settings and how you can ensure that your CSS code is compatible. There are browser-specific settings that you can add to ensure that your CSS code is compatible and works properly with that particular browser. Let's take the example of the Chrome browser and query it. First, I need to ensure that my CSS code is compatible with the browser. Queries require the use of media rules. These rules are used to apply different styles to different media types or devices. The WebKit min device pixel ratio, or WebKit device pixel ratio, is a media query rule which is used to specify the density of the schemes. These WebKit rules are part of the media query rule used as a non-standard way of setting parameters for aspects such as screen resolution, viewport height of the browser, and so on. I have set the value to be 0 for this example. Typically, the values are 0, 0.75, 1, or 1.5. I can also set the properties for specific rules. In this example, I've used the general query and I've applied it to a paragraph. If I want to configure some of the settings only for specific browsers, I can do that as well. In this example, notice that I have set the CSS rules to be compatible only with the Safari browser. Similar to defining rules inside the CSS file, Internet Explorer makes use of conditional comments inside HTML, which makes the code compatible with Internet Explorer. The support for conditional comments in the latest versions of Internet Explorer has been deprecated, but they served as an important bridge to ensure compatibility with earlier versions. There are a number of media queries and variations for these conditional comments and other browser-specific settings that I can add to the CSS and HTML code. Adding such media queries and other CSS code for setting compatibility with browsers is a vast topic all by itself that can be explored beyond the scope of conventional CSS rules. Fortunately, there are many CSS libraries available to help ensure that your CSS rules are consistent across browsers, such as Modernizer, Reset.css, and Normalize.css. Previously, when CSS incompatibilities were quite prevalent among different browsers, a simple solution was found in the form of CSS Reset. A CSS Reset file consists of rules that will reset the values for different types of selectors, pseudoclasses, and so on before the actual rules are implemented. While browser incompatibilities are greatly reduced, the practice of CSS Reset is still followed by designers to ensure cross-browser compatibility. In this video, you learned about CSS compatibility and the issues that can occur between different browsers when rendering CSS. You learned how each browser has its own rendering engine and that developers can use specialized websites to check their CSS code is valid on multiple browsers. Finally, you explored browser-specific settings that you can add to your CSS code to ensure it's compatible and works properly with particular browsers. Well done. As you may have experienced when using different apps in your everyday life, first impressions matter, whether you are using an app to make a photo collage or to order food online. If you are using a new app and it doesn't behave the way you expect it to, it makes a bad first impression on you. It may very well leave you feeling frustrated and seeking alternatives that can deliver what you need. To combat scenarios like this, developers employ rigorous user interface or UI testing strategies to ensure optimal customer satisfaction. UI testing is a complex area with many techniques and strategies used by developers. The strategies you will use will often be determined by business priority, customer requirements, and project timelines. In this video, you will learn about some UI testing strategies in specific cross-device testing. You will also discover practical examples of how to do cross-device testing in the browser. There are many UI testing strategies and an even wider range of tools available to implement them. The most common strategies used during development are automated user acceptance testing, cross-device testing, and visual regression testing. You can learn more about the other types of testing in future courses. For now, let's just focus on cross-device testing. Cross-device testing involves the manual or automated use of different devices to test the layout and behavior of an application. The goal of this testing strategy is to ensure user experience consistency between different devices. Think of all the different mobile devices and their screen sizes and internal hardware. There are a lot of possibilities. Many companies use the most common devices for testing, as less common devices could have a low return on investment versus the cost of maintaining and running the tests on those devices. So if you have an old phone stashed in a drawer somewhere, chances are that modern apps won't work on the devices as well as they're supposed to. Now that you've learned about the different types of UI testing, you are ready to learn how to use web developer tools to manually perform cross-device testing. In my web browser, I've opened one of my previously developed web pages for the Little Lemon restaurant. I've opened the browser developer tools by right-clicking the page and selecting Inspect Element. An alternative way to open the tools is to press F12. To begin cross-device testing the web page, I can click the Toggle Device Toolbar button. On the top of the browser, I can now change the browser view to simulate different devices. If I click on the Edit button, I can select additional devices to add to the toolbar. However, it is important to note that this will only simulate the screen size of the device, not the actual hardware. Luckily, the browser also has tools available to closely simulate certain network and hardware conditions. In the Performance tab of the Developer Tools, I can use the Network option to simulate different mobile network speeds. Additionally, I can use the CPU option to slow down the web browser as if it was running on a slow or older device. This will allow me to view how my web page performs in different environments. Of course, this is all simulated. There are many tools available to perform testing on virtual mobile software and also on real mobile hardware. Many businesses have in-house labs with many mobile devices to perform more real-world environment testing. If you're interested in learning more, review the links included in the additional reading material. You should now be able to identify the main UI testing strategies used to ensure customer satisfaction. And what's more, you also learned about the web developer tools you can use to perform cross-device testing.
An untested application is a wildcard. You have no idea whether it works or it doesn't work. A tested application gives you confidence that what was originally built is working as intended. Hi, I am Benedict Hobart. I am a front-end engineer at Meta. So testing is really important to make sure your app is of high quality and make sure it doesn't break. And being able to test every feature in your app or every part of your product means that you'll be made aware of problems in your app, and it's much easier to fix a problem when it happens than 6 months down the road when someone finds out it's broken and you need to work out what happened. You write a lot of code over time, and one small problem in one subsystem can end up leading to a multitude of errors in your app. Like, when you're building a messaging app and messaging goes down for an hour, people can't contact their friends and family, right? They can't contact their loved ones. They're disconnected. So it's really important for your users that you build something reliable and doesn't break. And testing is the easiest way to do that. When I first learned front-end testing, it was actually pretty satisfying to get the tooling working and then to have your own app that you just build executed automatically or exercised in some continuous integration somewhere. So front-end testing and testing as a whole at Meta is very important. We have this whole initiative called Better Engineering, which is about building high-quality applications. We approach testing in a number of ways. We've got end-to-end testing, which we basically spin up a web browser in the cloud and we run tests that interact with the browser automatically and make sure that the app is working. And then there's unit testing, which is usually a good case for unit testing is in something like when you're doing end-to-end encrypted messaging, you want to make sure your cryptography works as you'd expect, that the inputs match the outputs and that certain things are guaranteed. The people involved in front-end testing, I guess there's two main groups. There's the product teams building products that our consumers, clients use. And they're the ones that should be writing tests to make sure that their product is stable. Then there's like the teams that build the test frameworks themselves. And they're the ones that make sure that those tests run with high reliability, that those tests run before we ship code to users or to people. So we aren't shipping broken experiences. I see it as a responsibility of everyone to be writing tests at the company for their respective parts. There's not going to be one super team that comes in and tests your product for you because they don't know how your product works. Usually what we do is set a testing bar. So for every new feature, we make sure there's at least a few tests for it. And that way our product isn't actually ready to release until we've already tested it. And so that gives us a lot more confidence than we otherwise would have. Testing is valuable. It can feel like a waste of time at first, but it is not. 8 months down the line when your app explodes and you're trying to work out why those testings could have saved you. The testing is also its own challenging activity. Writing good tests is hard. Take pride in writing tests in the same way you'd take pride in building any of the products you want to build. Good luck in your first experience testing. It's going to be very fundamental as you move forward in your career.
Congratulations, you've reached the end of this module on interactive CSS, where you delve deeper into CSS by applying increasingly specific styling to various elements. It's now time to review what you've learned. You began this module with a lesson on creating layouts. You learned about CSS web layouts, where you discussed the grid and flexbox module, common flex layouts, and examples of common page layouts like column, grid, and stack, CSS units of measurement, basic flexbox, flex charts, and CSS grids. In this lesson, you also applied what you learned by creating a custom layout using grids in an ungraded lab. Lesson 2 focused on CSS selectors. You learned about widely used advanced selectors, all selectors and their specificity, combination selectors that demonstrate the granular selection of embedded elements, targeted CSS to style given elements using granular selection, and the concepts and practical uses of pseudo classes and elements. In this lesson, you also completed an ungraded lab testing your ability to style given elements using granular selection. The third lesson was about CSS Effects, and in this portion of the module, you learned about what effects are and how web presentation can be enhanced by the use of effects, how to use text effects like shadow and glow, CSS animation and basic animation principles, CSS keyframe animation, and preprocessors to demonstrate simple keyframe animation. Additionally, you completed an ungraded lab about transforming and transitioning elements and their role in animation. The fourth and last lesson was about debugging, where you learned how to inspect, diagnose, and resolve CSS and HTML issues. In your exploration of this topic, you learned about common errors, handling errors, debugging the front end, how browser developer tools can assist with debugging HTML and CSS issues, conditional comments, and UI testing. You should now be familiar with the basics of interactive CSS and the debugging tools available to diagnose and resolve CSS and HTML issues. You also know more about creating layouts, using CSS selectors, and applying CSS effects. You've done a great job so far. Keep up the good work and continue progressing in your learning journey. Wow, you've made it to the end of the course. Why don't you take a moment to congratulate yourself? After all, you've learned a lot in this course. Let's recap. In the very first module, you learned how HTML and CSS are used in the real world. You also learned about semantic tags and how important a structured approach to creating a well-formed web page is. And you learned about metadata and tags and how you can use them to influence your web page's ranking through search engine optimization or SEO. Now that was important. After metadata and tags, you moved on to user input and forms, and you created and tested a form by yourself. Well done. The last part of this module was about media elements, and you ended on a high note by learning how to embed video and audio in a web page. After media elements, you took a deep dive into CSS layouts, grids, and flexboxes in the next module. Layouts are fundamental to designing a good web page because they divide a page into different sections, thereby making the viewport more presentable. I'm sure you learned a lot in this section about how to make sure that your user is always presented with a good viewport. The next section was about CSS selectors, which correspond to specific elements or element groups in a HTML document. You learned that you can combine more than one selector, so you can apply rules to elements based on their relationship with one another. That's neat. And with pseudo-class selectors, you can improve the interactivity of your web pages without having to add overly advanced styling. Ultimately, you should now know how to use CSS selectors, like attribute selectors, to apply rules to different HTML elements with varying degrees of specificity. In the second last part of this module, you learned about keyframes, animations, and effects in CSS, essential knowledge and skills for any front-end developer. Let's refresh your memory about what those effects include. Think of sliding galleries, cursor effects, and the hover effect, which is very frequently used on web pages. While it's tempting to add lots of animations and effects, you should remember that it can be distracting for users and it may cause your web page to load slowly. The last part of the second module was all about how to use browser developer tools to assist with debugging HTML and CSS issues. Developers make mistakes all the time, and they're a normal part of the process. So don't feel bad when you make a mistake. That's what debugging is for, to figure out where something went wrong and how you can fix it. Debugging can't happen without testing, and you also learned about UI testing strategies, such as cross-device testing and a range of tools that can help eliminate problems in code. Wow, you covered a lot in this course. This might only be the start of your journey towards becoming a HTML and CSS developer, but you can be very proud of yourself for how much you've already learned and accomplished. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to embark on this journey of discovery with you. Best of luck in the future. You might recall learning about client personas earlier in the course. For the project, you have to choose one client persona to develop a homepage for. But if you want to practice, you can build multiple web pages using the different HTML and CSS skills that you've learned. In this video, you will learn how to approach and plan a web page layout so you can practice for your own project. First, let's start with the visual layout. The web page should have the company logo at the top of the page with a navigation menu underneath. The main content of the page should be below the navigation menu. At the bottom of the page is the footer. The navigation menu requires 4 links to be laid out horizontally. One link must be to the home page you are developing. Depending on the client persona you've chosen, the other links can be to product pages, contact forms, or company information pages. The main content should feature a large banner that links to the client's current promotional offer. Below the promotional banner, there are 3 columns. Each column should contain an image followed by a heading and some text. Again, depending on the client you choose, these can contain offerings or information about the client. The footer is split into 2 columns. The left column will contain a small version of the client logo, and the right column will contain copyright text. Now that you know what the visual requirements are, let's examine how you can structure the HTML and CSS for this layout. Remember that it's important to semantically structure your HTML document so search engines and accessibility software can understand the semantics of the web page. So it's best to start by planning out the semantic structure. You should use the header element for the logo, the nav element for the navigation, the main element for the main content, and the footer element for the footer of the page. Once you've set up your semantic HTML structure, the next step is to plan your grid layout for the main content and footer. For these parts of the web page, you can use either a CSS grid or a flexbox layout. It's important to plan your CSS rules for the different size columns that are required. Remember, you'll need a full width column and 3 1/3 columns for the main content. To simplify the main content, consider splitting the content into 2 rows, then 2 half-width columns for the footer. One last note, it's important to plan your units of measurement. When defining your CSS rules and properties, it will be easier to maintain and debug your CSS if your units are consistent throughout the code. As you learned earlier in the course, choosing a unit such as M or Rem for your CSS at the beginning of the project and sticking to it will help you as you progress further. And that's the end of this video about planning a web page. First, you consider the visual layout, then the HTML and CSS structure for the layout, followed by the semantic structure, and then the grid layout. In the next video, you'll learn how to start writing the HTML and CSS for the project.
When building a web page, it's considered good practice to do the layout and positioning of your HTML elements before working on their visual styling. Think of building a house. After all, you don't paint it first. Instead, you start with the foundation and structure. I'm going to take you through the process of building my HTML structure and positioning the elements so that you can follow along and note the placement of key elements for display. For this project, I chose the Little Lemon restaurant as the client persona. I've opened Visual Studio Code and I've created my index.html file with the semantic HTML document structure based on the barebones layout from week 1. In my semantic structure, I use the header element for the logo, the nav element for the navigation bar, the main element for the main page content, and the footer element for the footer. The navigation bar uses an unordered list for the navigation links. In the main element, I set up 2 section elements, one for each row of the content. Each row is its own element, so I can use a flexbox layout to split the content into the required number of columns. I use the article element to represent each column. This is because the content of each column will be self-contained and not related to the other columns. I use a similar approach for splitting the footer into two columns, except instead of using the article element for columns, I use a div element. This is because semantically, the footer content should be considered as a whole. And additionally, it isn't important content for search engines and accessibility software. Since I want to split the footer visually into two columns, I use the div element to allow for the flexbox layout. I save the file and open the web page in the web browser. The content is displaying on the web page, but I need to lay out and position the elements using CSS. I go back to Visual Studio Code and open styles.css in the CSS folder on the left. I already set up some rules for the body and heading elements. I decided to use REM as a unit of measurement for this project, so the font sizes, margins, and padding properties of my CSS rules will all be REM values. The only exception to this rule is the body element, where the left and right margins are set to 5% of the window size. Let's start by adding a rule to center the logo. I use an element selector to select the image element that is a descendant of the header element. I then apply 3 CSS properties to the CSS rule. First, I set the display property to block, so that the element changes from an inline element to a block level element. Then, I set the margin left and margin right properties to auto. These 3 properties together will center the logo inside of the header element. Next, I need to lay out the navigation menu horizontally. To do this, I add an element selector to select the unordered list element that is a descendant of the nav element. I then apply 2 CSS properties to the CSS rule. First, I set the list style property to none to remove the bullet point at the beginning of each element. Then I set the text align property to center the inline elements. Next, I add another CSS rule. This time, the selector will select the list item element that is a descendant of the nav element. I then apply the display property and set its value to inline block. I save the file and open the web page in the web browser. So far, so good. Both the logo and the navigation bar are centered. Next, I need to set up the flexbox layout. I add another CSS rule using the element selector to select the section element. I then add the display property and set its value to flex. Next, I add the CSS rule using the element selector to select the article element. I then set the flex property to 1. I save the file and open the web page in the web browser. Now the main content is laid out correctly, with 1 column in the first row and 3 columns in the second row. Finally, I'll set the layout for the footer. First, I add a CSS rule using the element selector to select the footer element. I then add the display property and set its value to flex. Then I add another CSS rule. This time the selector will select the div element that is a descendant of the footer element. I then set the flex property to 1. I save the file again and open the web page in the web browser. Success! The web page elements are now laid out and positioned correctly. Laying out and positioning your HTML elements first will always save you time later on when you begin applying visual improvements and animations. Doing it this way means that your web page has a good, strong foundational layout to work from, and to which you can add the paint and decor, the visual styling of your web page. Take some time to practice building your HTML structure and setting up the positioning of your elements.
A key part of building a website is to ensure both a good user interface and a good user experience. But what's the difference between those two and what makes them good or bad? This video will explain the difference between user interface, UI, and user experience, UX, as well as the concept of intentional engagement, which will help you design a good user experience for your web page visitors. User experience, or UX, is how a user interacts with the web page or app as a whole. That includes presentation of information, the flow between different sections, and the ease of use. One way of thinking about it is to consider ketchup bottle design. Most ketchup bottles have a lid at the top. This lets you get ketchup out with relative ease when the bottle is full, but it becomes increasingly difficult to get to the ketchup at the bottom of the bottle as it empties out. A better user experience is a ketchup bottle with the lid at the bottom instead. This design lets gravity do the work of getting the ketchup out of the bottle. Now that's a good user experience design. User experience is driven by the needs and viewpoint of the user. There are many different UX design processes that are used by businesses, such as stakeholder interviews, user research, UX audit and scenario mapping, and client persona. In fact, you're already using the last one, client persona, for your homepage project. Creating a client persona is a good process for planning a website through the point of view of a potential client and their customers. But for this project, let's focus on another process you can use to improve the user experience: intentional engagement. The goal of engagement is to keep the user interacting with your website and, depending on the business, drive revenue through purchases or interaction with advertisements. Because the web page you're building is targeted towards customers that fit the client persona, the user experience should be driven by how the customers will engage with the website. It is a good exercise to list what customers will be looking for when they visit the website and try to make it as easy as possible for your users to get that information. With this in mind, think about what should be displayed in the main section of the homepage and what links should be listed in the navigation bar. But such concerns shouldn't come at the cost of business goals. The business may have revenue goals that it aims to achieve through promotions and discounts. So balancing business and user goals is a key part of designing the user experience. Now that you have thought about user experience some more, review your homepage design and consider the user experience it facilitates. How does client persona and intentional engagement fit into your own UX design strategy? Answers to those questions will help you plan your process.
In this video, I will demonstrate how I put together the homepage for the Little Lemon restaurant. I will focus especially on why the positioning of elements is so important. Keep this in mind when you are working on your own project. After setting up the positioning of my elements, I plan out the user experience and implement the visual styling of the page. I decide that the user experience should balance business revenue goals with common information that a customer needs. The result is a homepage that displays the current promotional offering in the large display area, also known as the hero area. Then in the smaller 3 columns, I link to the menu, the booking system, and display information about the opening hours of the restaurant. Let's examine the additional CSS I added to improve the visuals of the page. In Visual Studio Code, I open styles.css in the CSS folder. First, I apply the font size and margin properties to the heading elements and to the nav elements. This improves the visual spacing of these elements. To be consistent with the rest of the CSS, I use the REM unit of measurement. Next, I add CSS rules to adjust the text decoration of the navigation links. For the anchor link CSS rule, I set the text decoration property to none. Then I add a CSS rule that uses the hover pseudo-class of the anchor selector and set the text decoration property to underline. Now when you hover over the navigation link, an underline appears below the text. Then I update the section and footer CSS rules. I add the gap property and set its value to 2 rem, 1 rem. This applies a 2 rem gutter between the flex rows and a 1 rem gutter between the columns. These settings improve the spacing between the column elements. I also add the margin top and margin bottom properties and set their values to 1 rem to increase the spacing between section elements. Next, I update the article element so that the contents won't be close to the left and right edges of the element. To do this, I added the padding left and padding right CSS properties and set their value to 1 rem. For the hero area, I use CSS to apply a background image to the content. However, to ensure the text is still readable, I overlay a semi-transparent gradient on top of the image. Then I rounded the border of the article elements using the border radius CSS property. And last, for the paragraph element in the footer containing the copyright information, I set the text align property to right so the text aligns to the right side of the element. I also set the top border to a solid 0.1 rem line to add a small visual flare above the copyright information. I'm sure you now grasp why starting with the positioning of elements is so important. Adding all the visual stylings is a lot easier once the elements are in place. Before the peer review assessment, spend some time practicing adding visual improvements to your page's design.
Congratulations on reaching the end of this HTML and CSS in-depth course in the Front-End Developer program. You've worked hard to get here, learned a lot and developed a lot of new skills during the course. You were able to demonstrate some of this learning and your practical HTML and CSS development skill set by creating a video and audio player that can rate media and a homepage for a client persona. In addition to these, following your completion of this course in HTML and CSS development, you should now be able to use common semantic and meta tags, as well as web page layouts and components using HTML. Create forms with client-side validation using HTML. Create layouts, charts, effects, and animations using CSS. And perform basic front-end testing, debugging, and error handling. So, what are the next steps? Well, this is the 4th course in the Front-End Developer program, and you have gained a valuable understanding of important concepts and practical skills. You probably realize that there's still more for you to learn. If you found this course helpful and want to discover more, then why not register for the next course on React Basics? Throughout each of the courses in the program, you'll continue to expand your skill set. And in the final assessment, you'll bring together all the skills you've learned to manage your own project. Whether you're just starting out as a technical professional or a student, this project will enable you to prove your knowledge and ability. Once you've completed all the courses in this Front-End Developer program, you'll receive Coursera certification. Certifications provide globally recognized and industry-endorsed evidence of mastering technical skills. Well done on taking steps towards a future career. Your project experience so far shows employers that you are self-driven and innovative. It also speaks volumes about you as an individual and your drive to continue your educational progress. Congratulations once again on reaching the end of this course. It's been a voyage of discovery. Best of luck and do continue to pursue your own learning objectives to their final goal.